The night opens like a quiet field beneath the ancient stars. As you settle into stillness, imagine yourself thousands of years ago, when the first villages were built and the first fires were tended, not only for warmth but also for meaning. The Neolithic world was simple, yet full of mystery. The moon's phases, the ripening of grain, the silence of death, the sudden spark of life. You are invited to drift into that world. Each story, each ritual, each carved stone or whispered prayer carries the memory of humanity's earliest dreams of the divine. Tonight, you will not walk alone. You will wander among ancestors who raised stones to the sky, who painted caves with visions, and who offered seeds back to the soil in gratitude. As you listen, let the rhythm of their beliefs soften your breath, guiding you toward sacred rest. Chapter 1: The Dawn of Neolithic Villages. When people first began to gather in small farming communities, the world itself was changing. For tens of thousands of years, human life had moved in rhythms of hunting, foraging, and following herds across the land. But in the Neolithic age, something shifted. Instead of wandering, people began to stay. They built homes, shaped fields, and returned season after season to the same soil. This change was not only material, it was spiritual. For the first time, humanity could feel rooted, not only in place, but in meaning. A village was more than a cluster of huts. It was a living organism. The houses stood close, walls of clay and timber pressed against the earth, smoke rising in pale threads from central fires. Between them lay paths worn smooth by footsteps, children's laughter, and the movements of animals kept near. At the center, a hearth glowed, not only warming hands, but also anchoring the invisible sense of belonging. Life in these villages was still fragile. Harvests could fail, disease could strike, storms could scatter. Yet, within this fragility, people discovered patterns. They noticed how the length of the day shaped the sprouting of grain. They saw how the phases of the moon mirrored the swelling and waning of rivers. They felt how birth and death in the community echoed the cycles of seed and harvest. Slowly, survival and observation became more than practical knowledge. They became threads of reverence. A day's work in a Neolithic settlement was heavy, but it was never just labor. Each act held a quiet ritual. Grinding grain was a prayer of repetition, the stone wheel circling endlessly like the sun's own path. Planting seeds meant trusting the earth to return what was given. Even carrying water from a spring could become a small ceremony, for the jar was lifted not only with muscle, but with gratitude. In this way, the ordinary began to blur into the sacred. The hearth stood at the heart of this new life. Archaeologists often find thick layers of ash, traces of meals cooked and fires tended, sometimes for generations. To the people who lived around these flames, the hearth was more than practical warmth. It was presence, a spirit that held the community together. To let the fire die was to break continuity. To keep it alive was to protect the thread between yesterday and tomorrow. In many later cultures, this reverence for the hearth remained. Roman families honored Vesta, the goddess of the sacred flame. Ancient Greeks kept their household fires burning as symbols of protection. But even before names and myths were given, the Neolithic hearth already carried a sacred gravity. The soil, too, became sacred. For the first time, people truly depended on the land, not just as a hunting ground, but as a partner. Each furrow dug into the earth was like a wound, and each sprouting shoot was a promise. Offerings were sometimes buried in fields, grains, small figurines, or fragments of tools. These were not random acts. They were gestures of reciprocity, a way of saying, we take, but we also give. This was not yet formal religion, but it was ritual in its purest form, the act of binding human life to cycles greater than itself. Within villages, graves often appeared near homes, sometimes directly beneath them. Death did not remove someone from the community. The dead were kept close, their presence folded into the daily rhythms of life. A child might grow up sleeping above the buried bones of a grandmother. This practice suggests a profound view of continuity. The living and the dead were not divided into separate worlds. They coexisted. In this way, the village was both shelter for the living and sanctuary for the departed. As days and years moved in their steady turn, people began to see life not as a straight path, but as a circle. The planting of seeds and the return of crops became a visible mirror of their own lives. Birth, maturity, and death were not endings, but stages. Each season returned just as the sun rose again each morning. Through these cycles, an early philosophy emerged, that existence itself was bound to rhythms, and to live well was to live in harmony with them. These beginnings might feel simple compared to later temples or scriptures, but they were no less profound. When we imagine early villagers gathered in silence at sunset, watching the sky fade to violet, we see more than curiosity. We see the first shape of religion, not as dogma, but as awe. They asked no grand theological questions, yet their lives were full of answers written in the grain, the fire, the soil, and the stars. What is striking about this age is how closely survival and spirit were entwined. In later centuries, religion often grew apart from daily labor, moving into temples and priestly hierarchies. But in the Neolithic villages, spirituality was inseparable from life itself. To bake bread was to honor the grain. To dig clay for walls was to touch the body of the earth. To watch the moon was to count time in light. The sacred was not distant. It was in every gesture, every task, every breath of wind across a field. Archaeological sites, such as Katal Yuk in modern-day Turkey, reveal glimpses of this woven life. There, wall paintings show animals and geometric designs. Shrines built into houses contained horns of bulls, symbols of strength and fertility. The dead were buried beneath floors, covered in ochre, their bones later retrieved and reshaped into plastered skulls. These practices hint at ritual systems where daily living space doubled as sacred space. A house was not only shelter, it was temple. The rise of villages also meant the rise of community memory. Knowledge could be preserved not only in wandering stories, but in physical places. A stone set upright at the village edge, a worn path leading to a spring, a mound of earth where ancestors rested. All these became landmarks of memory. Over generations, such places gathered a weight beyond the practical. They became sacred geography. To step on that soil was to touch the past and to stand within its continuity. It is easy, from the distance of modern time, to see these practices as primitive. Yet if you pause and reflect, you may sense how close they still are to us. We light candles for warmth, but also for remembrance. We gather at tables not only to eat, but to connect. We still measure life by seasons, by birthdays, harvests, and the turning of years. Beneath the complexity of modern religions, the root is still visible, a human need to belong to rhythms larger than ourselves. The dawn of Neolithic villages was in essence the dawn of meaning in place. For the first time, humanity found permanence permanence in soil, in fire, in walls, in graves, and in memory. This permanence gave rise to reverence, and reverence gave rise to ritual. Out of this quiet shift, from wandering to dwelling, from surviving to belonging, grew the foundations of spiritual life as we know it. And perhaps this raises a gentle question. As you picture these first villages, their fires glowing against the night, their fields stretching under the sky, do you feel the same longing they once felt? The longing to belong, not only to a house or a community, but to the earth itself. In their simple acts, planting seeds, tending flames, remembering the dead, they may have already answered the question that still lingers in every age. How do we live? Not just to survive, but to be part of something eternal. Chapter 2: Sacred Fire and the Hearth as a temple in the earliest villages of the Neolithic age. There was one element that burned at the heart of human life: fire. To modern eyes, fire is ordinary. We flick a switch, strike a match, and light appears without struggle. But for those who lived thousands of years ago, fire was both miracle and mystery. It could not be created casually. It had to be preserved, carried, and protected. A single flame could mean survival for an entire community. Because of this, fire quickly became more than practical heat. It became presence. It was spirit, transformation, and memory. The hearth, where flames were kept alive, was no longer just a tool of survival. It became a temple in miniature, a place where food, warmth, and prayer intertwined. Archaeological excavations across ancient settlements show traces of these hearths. In the site of Yok, in modern-day Turkey, homes were tightly packed, each with a central fire pit. Layers of ash accumulated over years of use, marking the rhythm of meals, of seasons, of generations. In some houses, the hearth was decorated, framed with symbolic horns or painted designs. This was not decoration alone. It was recognition that the fire was sacred, a presence at the center of life. The act of tending the flame carried deep meaning. Someone in the household, often a woman, though not always, was entrusted with keeping the fire alive. If the flames dwindled to embers, they were carefully coaxed back. If they went out entirely, new fire had to be brought, often from a neighbor or from a sacred communal flame. In this way, the continuity of fire was tied to the continuity of the community itself. To let it die was more than inconvenience. It was symbolic failure, a break in the bond between people and the unseen forces they relied upon. Ashes, too, held power. In many Neolithic and later traditions, ashes were not discarded thoughtlessly. They were spread on fields to bless crops, or kept in containers as memory of sacred fires past. Ash was what remained when fire had consumed all substance. It carried both the memory of life and the echo of offering. In this way, ashes became a quiet symbol. What is burned is not lost, but transformed. The symbolism of fire extended beyond the hearth. Across cultures, we find echoes of how fire was imagined as a divine bridge. In Indo-European traditions, the sacred fire was a messenger, carrying offerings of grain or fat upward to the gods. In Vedic India, the fire god Agni was not only flame but mediator. Through him, prayers rose and sacrifices reached the divine realm. This belief in fire as an intercessor was not an invention of advanced civilizations alone. Its seed was already present in the Neolithic, when every flickering flame hinted at a reality beyond itself. What is it about fire that inspired such reverence? Perhaps it was its dual nature. It gives life and takes it. It warms, cooks, and protects, but it also burns, consumes, and destroys. It is untouchable yet present, dangerous yet vital. In the glow of a fire, early people must have seen something otherworldly, a living thing that fed on wood and air, never still, never silent, yet never fully material. Fire was the first true element of transformation visible to the human eye. It turned wood into ash, flesh into smoke, darkness into light. Transformation, after all, is at the heart of all ritual and religion. When gathered around the hearth, the community experienced more than safety. They experienced togetherness. Shadows flickered on the walls, stories were told, food was shared. The fire drew people inward, just as temples and sanctuaries would in later ages. The circle of light around the hearth was the first sacred space, a place where humanity felt enclosed, protected, and connected. To sit by fire was to be part of a greater whole. Some scholars suggest that the worship of hearth fire was one of the earliest shared religions. In Greece, the goddess Hestia represented the sacred flame of the home. In Rome, the cult of Vesta preserved an eternal fire in the Forum, tended by the Vestal Virgins. If the fire went out, it was believed disaster would strike the state itself. The echoes of this belief can be traced back to the Neolithic mind, when the hearth fire was the first thread binding family, community, and cosmos. Fire also shaped myth. In nearly every culture, stories of fire's origins speak of theft, of gift, or of divine intervention. The Greeks told of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. Polynesian myths speak of Maui bringing fire from the underworld. In some Native American traditions, animals carried fire to humans with great risk. The very presence of such myths reveals how humanity never saw fire as simple. It was a treasure, a sacred inheritance, something that connected mortal beings to the forces of heaven and earth. Reflecting on these ancient practices, one can imagine the atmosphere of a Neolithic night. Outside, darkness stretched across the fields. The stars were distant, cold, and silent. But within the village, the hearth glowed, a small sun at the center of human life. Around it, people ate, prayed, sang, and sometimes wept. The flame's steady pulse reminded them that they were not alone, that something enduring carried them through the night. In many ways, the hearth was the first altar. Later, religions would build stone sanctuaries, carve idols, and raise temples that touched the sky. But before all of that, humanity knelt before fire. They offered it food, fat, and fragments of grain. They whispered prayers into its rising smoke, and they believed, in some wordless way, that the flame carried those prayers upward, into realms beyond sight. The fire was also a teacher. It taught impermanence, for flames always change shape. It taught vigilance, for a flame left untended dies. It taught reciprocity, for what is placed into fire does not vanish, but transforms. In this sense, the hearth was both a domestic necessity and a spiritual guide. The people of the Neolithic did not have scriptures to read, but they had fire to contemplate. Its lessons were written not in words but in light, heat, and ash. Even today, we feel echoes of this reverence. We light candles at vigils. We gather around campfires. We speak of keeping the flame alive as a metaphor for love, memory, or commitment. These modern gestures are distant descendants of the ancient truth that fire is more than physical. It is presence, it is continuity, it is spirit. Perhaps, as you picture those ancient hearths, you can sense the weight of silence that would fall when a fire burned low, when embers glowed softly and only the crackle of wood remained. In that silence, people may have asked themselves unanswerable questions. Where does the fire come from? Where does it go when it dies? Does the smoke carry part of us upward with it? These are questions still worth asking, even now. The Neolithic people did not yet know chemistry, nor could they explain combustion. But they understood something deeper. That fire was a mystery worth honoring. Every flame was protective, eternal, humble, and holy. To keep it alive was to remain connected to forces beyond comprehension. To lose it was to fall into darkness. And so the hearth stood not only as a place of cooking, but as a temple of transformation. A temple without walls, built of light, warmth, and trust. From its glow, humanity's ritual imagination began to expand. For in fire, people saw what religion would always seek, a bridge between the human and the divine, between what is perishable and what endures. Chapter 3: Caves, Darkness, and Painted Dreams. Long before humanity raised temples of stone, long before pillars, sanctuaries, or shrines, there were caves. The earth itself provided the first enclosures of worship. Hidden openings in cliffs, cracks in hillsides, and deep caverns in mountains became places where the earliest spiritual imagination was. Awakened, the cave is unlike any other place in nature. To step inside is to leave the familiar world of light. Outside, there are rivers, skies, and trees. Inside, there is stillness. There is silence. There is the scent of stone and the breath of darkness. For early humans, this crossing must have felt like a passage, a movement from the ordinary into the extraordinary. Archaeologists studying sites such as Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, and Chouvet in the Ardèche Valley have found astonishing images painted on cave walls, some dating back more than 30,000 years. Bison, horses, deer, and abstract symbols appear in layers of ochre, charcoal, and mineral pigments. These were not mere decorations. They were visions, preserved in stone. By torchlight or firelight, the animals seemed to move, their shapes shifting in the flicker of flame. In those trembling shadows, people witnessed living myths, stories that carried power beyond words. It is difficult to know with certainty what the artists intended. The images may have been prayers for the hunt, ensuring success and survival. They may have been teaching tools, lessons passed to younger generations. Or they may have been attempts to reach beyond the material world, to touch the spiritual through art and ritual. Whatever the purpose, the cave walls became canvases for dreams, dreams that reached past the boundaries of the visible world. Entering a cave was not a casual act. In many traditions, the cave was seen as a womb of the earth, a sacred enclosure that gave life, but also reminded of death. To descend into its darkness was to return to origins, to the hidden source of all being. The echo of footsteps, the cool, damp air, and the slow drip of water would have filled early visitors with awe. Silence within the cave was not emptiness, but presence, the presence of something greater than the self. In this sense, the cave functioned as the first temple. Unlike later sanctuaries built by human hands, caves required no construction. They were ready-made, eternal, and mysterious. To those who entered, they felt given, not built. This gave them a special quality. They were not human achievements, but divine gifts. The link between caves and the sacred did not end with prehistory. Across cultures, caves continued to serve as sites of vision and revelation. In Greek mythology, caves were homes of nymphs, oracles, and gods. The cave of Apollo at Delphi was believed to emit vapors that allowed the Pythia to speak prophecy. In early Christianity, hermits withdrew into caves to pray in silence, seeing them as natural monasteries. In Buddhism, monks carved entire cave complexes into cliffs, turning natural shelters into sanctuaries filled with statues and painted sutras. But even before these traditions, the cave had another meaning. It was a place of initiation. For a young hunter, entering the cave may have meant stepping into adulthood, facing the darkness and emerging with new understanding. For a shaman or spiritual leader, it may have been a place of vision quests, where solitude and silence allowed for contact with unseen worlds. In both cases, the cave was transformative. One entered as one person and left as another. The interplay of fire and shadow within caves cannot be overstated. Imagine a small group of people gathered deep inside, their torches burning. The walls are alive with paintings, the animals seeming to leap and run in the shifting glow. The firelight casts long shadows that dance across the surfaces, turning still images into moving spirits. In this way, myth itself came alive. The boundary between story and reality blurred. The cave became a theater of the sacred, where imagination and environment merged. Symbols painted in caves often carried meanings beyond the hunt. Dots, spirals, handprints, and abstract marks appear beside the animals. Some scholars suggest these were signs of spiritual journeys, or maps of the cosmos, or even records of dreams. A hand pressed against the wall, outlined in pigment, is both personal and universal. It says, "I was here. I touched this stone. My spirit leaves its mark." It is both a signature and a prayer. Darkness itself played a crucial role. In modern times, we often associate darkness with fear. But for early humans, darkness could also be guide. To step into it was to be stripped of distraction. In darkness, one sees differently. One hears more sharply. One feels the weight of silence. In this altered state, the mind opens to visions, to dreams that daylight conceals. Many spiritual traditions, even much later, retained this understanding that the absence of light is not emptiness but doorway. In the silence of caves, early people may have sensed connections between life, death, and what lies beyond. Burials have been found within caves, suggesting that these chambers were also places of passage for the dead. To lay a body in the earth's hollow was to return it to the womb of creation, to entrust it to the mysteries of what follows life. Here, the boundaries blurred. Caves were at once sanctuaries for the living and resting places for the dead. We can reflect on how natural and inevitable this association was. The cave, enclosing and protective, mirrors the body of the mother. Birth begins in darkness, life emerges into light, and death returns once more to shadow. This cycle, womb, life, and tomb, may have been felt more strongly in those ancient chambers than anywhere else. Anthropologists remind us that caves also shaped early human imagination through acoustics. Within their chambers, sounds echo strangely. A chant, a drumbeat, even the simple striking of stone can create reverberations that transform ordinary noise into something otherworldly. Some researchers believe that paintings were deliberately placed in areas of special acoustics, where sound and image combined to create a powerful sensory ritual. The cave, in this sense, was not only seen but heard. From all of this emerges a picture of caves as the first spiritual theaters, where art, sound, darkness, and community combined into an experience of mystery. These experiences may not have been fully explained by those who lived them. They may have been felt, trusted, and passed down as tradition, as something sacred without needing to be named. And so, long before scriptures were written or doctrines formed, caves carried humanity into its earliest dreams of the divine. They were places where imagination was not fantasy, but ritual, where the hunt was not just survival, but story, where silence was not absence, but presence. When we think of those painted chambers today, we might ask, what stirred in the minds of those who made them? Did they believe the animals were spirits of the hunt, or companions, or gods? Did they believe the handprints connected them to ancestors? Or were these simply acts of wonder, the first attempts to give shape to the mystery of existence? Perhaps the truth lies in all of these possibilities. What matters is not a single answer, but the recognition that within caves, humanity learned to see the world differently. They learned to create symbols, to step into silence, to trust the power of darkness, and to dream. And maybe that is why, even now, caves continue to call us. They remind us of a time when the earth itself was temple, when the first prayers were painted on stone, and when the stillness of darkness was not fearsome but sacred. Chapter 4: Stones that reach for the sky cross the ancient landscapes of the world. Long before writing, before cities, and even before the first great temples, people raised stones. They lifted them upright, dragged them across fields, balanced them into circles, or set them in long, deliberate rows. These megaliths, great stones, still stand today, weathered yet enduring. Their meaning is not fully known, but their presence speaks louder than silence. They were not only engineering marvels, they were prayers in stone. To erect such monuments required immense effort. Communities came together, sometimes hauling stones that weighed many tons. With ropes, logs, and sheer determination, people moved what nature itself had fixed into the earth. The act was more than technical. It was communal, symbolic, and spiritual. Each stone set into place was a gesture, a reaching upward, a binding of heaven and earth. Archaeologists identify many forms of megaliths. There are standing pillars, or menhirs, solitary stones planted upright like markers of presence. There are dolmens, large slabs supported by upright stones, forming chambers for the dead. There are stone circles, perhaps the most famous being Stonehenge in England, arranged with careful precision to mark the cycles of the sun. And there are long alignments, such as those in Carnac, France, where rows of stones stretch across the land like frozen waves of devotion. The question that follows naturally is, why? Why did early people invest such labor into raising stones that served no obvious function of shelter or survival? One answer lies in the sky. Many megalithic sites are aligned with celestial events. The rising sun at the solstice, the setting of the moon at certain phases, the arc of stars. These were carefully observed and mirrored in stone. By aligning monuments with the heavens, people created earthly calendars. The stones told them when to plant, when to harvest, when seasons would turn. Yet beyond practicality, these alignments suggest a desire to tie the rhythms of heaven to the soil underfoot, to bring the eternal into daily life. For example, the midsummer sunrise aligns with the heelstone, sending the first light of the solstice directly into the circle. On the shortest day of the year, the midwinter sunset falls between another pair of stones, casting its glow into the heart of the monument. These alignments are too precise to be coincidence. They show a deep awareness of the cycles of light and dark, birth and decline that governed existence. But megaliths were not only calendars, they were also altars. Communities gathered at these places for ritual. Fires were lit, offerings given, chants or songs carried into the open air. The stones themselves became witnesses, silent presences holding memory. They marked the ground as sacred, set apart from ordinary fields and forests. To stand within such a circle was to be within a place of power, where the human and the divine might meet. The role of megaliths as burial markers also reveals their spiritual weight. Dolmens and passage graves housed the remains of the dead, sometimes aligned so that light would enter their chambers on specific days. At Newgrange in Ireland, a great mound built over 5,000 years ago contains a passage that fills with sunlight only at the winter solstice. For a few minutes each year, the rays of dawn illuminate the inner chamber where ancestors were laid to rest. Such precision tells us that death was not seen as an ending, but as part of a cycle tied to cosmic rhythms. The light's return each winter symbolized rebirth, renewal, and continuity between the living and the departed. There is a quiet humility in these monuments. They do not boast inscriptions. They carry no detailed records of kings or wars. Instead, they stand in silence, their meaning whispered only through their placement, their endurance, and their mystery. Perhaps this is why they still capture our imagination. Even now, they resist complete explanation. The act of raising stones was itself transformative. For the communities who labored together, the project created unity. Each person's effort contributed to something greater than themselves. The finished monument stood as proof of shared purpose, of collective devotion. It is possible that the process mattered as much as the result, that the work of moving and raising stones was itself ritual, an offering of strength and will. Reflecting on these structures, one senses a longing that is deeply human, the desire to reach beyond the fleeting moment, to connect with eternity. Stones endure where wood rots and flesh fades. By setting them upright, people declared their presence across time. They said, "We were here. We belonged. We sought the eternal." And so, megaliths became stories in stone. Each one told of alignment, of ritual, of remembrance. Each one bound community to land, land to sky, and the present to the eternal. Their presence reminds us that early humanity was not only concerned with survival, they were also seekers, dreamers, builders of meaning. Today, when we stand before these silent pillars, we cannot help but wonder, what words were spoken here? What prayers were whispered? What music or chants echoed between stones? We do not know, yet the stones themselves still speak, not in language, but in presence. They remind us of the eternal human longing for connection, for a bridge between earth and sky, between the seen and the unseen. In their stillness, they ask us a question: is not every life, in its way, a reaching towards something greater, a standing stone against the passage of time? Chapter 5: The First Farmers' Offerings to the Soil. Invention of agriculture marked one of the most profound transformations in human history. Before this shift, survival was tied to the chase of animals and the gathering of wild plants. Food was uncertain, found rather than made, dependent on what nature chose to give. But with the birth of farming, people began to live by new rhythms, the cycles of seed and harvest, the steady turning of seasons. The soil itself became a partner. It was not only earth beneath their feet, but the very source of life. Each handful of dirt held a mystery. Why did a seed vanish into its darkness and return as grain? Why did rain and sunlight transform the hidden into the visible, the fragile into the sustaining? To those first farmers, the field was no mere ground. It was a sacred being. Rituals grew alongside crops. Archaeological sites reveal that early farming communities placed offerings into the soil before planting. Small figurines, fragments of food, animal bones, or carefully shaped vessels were buried in furrows. These were gifts, tokens of gratitude and hope, given to the earth to ensure its fertility. The act of sowing was more than practical. It was an exchange, a covenant between humanity and the living ground. The cycle of planting and reaping became a mirror of life itself. A seed must die before it lives again. Buried in darkness, it breaks open, dissolves, and yet from this dissolution comes new growth. Farmers, watching this mystery year after year, saw in it a reflection of their own mortality. Death was not only an ending, it was part of a cycle that promised renewal. Grain returning from the soil was a lesson written in the fields. What is buried may rise again. This connection between agriculture and spiritual thought can be traced across cultures. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest centers of farming, myths told of gods tied to vegetation and grain. Tammuz, a shepherd deity, was also associated with crops that died in summer heat and returned with the rains. His annual death and resurrection reflected the pattern of the fields. In Egypt, Osiris was remembered not only as a ruler of the underworld, but as a god of vegetation. His body was linked to the Nile and the fertile soil that renewed each year. The planting of seed and the resurrection of Osiris became entwined in ritual memory, even before these written myths. The actions of Neolithic farmers suggest similar ideas. Grain pits were sometimes treated as sacred spaces, carefully lined and protected. Tools for planting were decorated with symbolic designs. In some places, human remains were buried beneath houses or near fields, linking ancestors to the soil that sustained the living. The land was not only productive, but inhabited by presence, by gods, by ancestors, by forces unseen yet essential. The harvest was equally sacred. To gather crops was to touch the blessing of survival. Communities often performed rituals of gratitude before reaping. Songs may have been sung, fires lit, first sheaves set aside as offerings. The first fruits were rarely eaten immediately. They were given back, returned to the soil or to the gods in thanks. In this gesture, the balance of giving and receiving was maintained. Without gratitude, fertility could not be assured. Farming also shaped social life. Villages grew around fields. With settled life came storage, surplus, and sharing. The rhythms of sowing and harvesting brought communities together in shared labor. Collective rituals at planting or harvest reinforced bonds, reminding all that survival depended not on individuals but on cooperation. These gatherings had a spiritual quality. They were not only work but worship, moments when the field became a temple and the harvest a sacred gift. Every seed carried weight. To plant it was to trust in the unseen. Once pressed into the soil, it was invisible, left vulnerable to weather and chance. Farmers waited with patience, watching the skies, listening to the wind, hoping for rain. This act of trust was deeply spiritual. It required faith that life would emerge from darkness, that the unseen would return as sustenance over time. The rhythms of agriculture inspired some of the earliest calendars. By watching the stars, People could predict the right time for planting and reaping. These patterns of the heavens became entwined with patterns of the soil. Sky and earth were no longer separate. They were partners, their cycles harmonized in the work of human hands. Festivals marking solstices and equinoxes often carried agricultural significance. The heavens told the farmers when to act, and their rituals tied these cosmic signs to earthly abundance. The sacredness of farming also appears in the earliest images of deities. Many of the so-called fertility figurines found in Neolithic sites, carved with rounded forms, may not have been depictions of women alone, but symbols of the fertile earth itself. The soil was imagined as a mother, swelling with life, nourishing those who dwelt upon her. To place offerings into her body was to honor her as the giver of all sustenance. We can pause to reflect on this perspective. Today, soil may seem ordinary, something underfoot, even something to be brushed away. But for early farmers, each furrow opened a door to the sacred. Each seed planted was a prayer of trust. Each harvest was a moment of reverence. Their lives were woven into the cycles of growth and decay, and their spirituality grew from this intimacy with the earth. The transformation agriculture brought was not only material but mental. To live by cycles of growth is to see time differently. The year is no longer a sequence of days alone, but a turning of seasons, each with meaning, each with ritual. Planting time is not simply labor, it is beginning. Harvest is not simply collection, it is culmination. The field becomes a mirror of existence, reminding humanity that all life follows these rhythms. The idea that death is not an end but a stage of renewal found fertile ground in this agricultural worldview. Seeds demonstrated at every season. Myths of dying and rising gods grew naturally from this observation. The spiritual imagination, fed by the soil, discovered hope in the cycles of grain. And so, farming was never only survival. It was survival transformed into sacred act. Every furrow drawn across the land was a line of devotion. Every seed cast into the earth was a prayer. Every sheaf of grain gathered was a blessing received with gratitude. The soil, silent and dark, was never empty. It was alive, responsive, mysterious. When we look back at these first farmers, we may wonder what they whispered as they pressed seeds into the ground. Did they call upon spirits, ancestors, gods? Did they sing songs to the soil, or to the rain, or to the wind? Did they stand in silence, offering only their breath as prayer? We may never know the exact words, but the gestures remain clear. Offerings buried, rituals performed, gratitude given, all point to the same truth. Farming was more than work. It was relationship, covenant, and reverence. Perhaps that is the lasting lesson of those early fields. That survival and spirituality are not separate but joined. That in the act of feeding the body, one also feeds the soul. That the soil beneath us is not simply ground, but the silent partner of life, deserving not only labor but gratitude. And maybe this is why, even now, we feel something when we stand in fields, when we see green shoots rising, when we watch harvests gathered. The ancient memory of reverence lingers, reminding us that every seed is both fragile and eternal, both a beginning and a promise. Chapter 6. Burial Rites and the Silent Language of Graves. Long before written scriptures, long before temples rose in stone, there was already a language of reverence. It was spoken not with words, but with gestures, with earth and silence. This language was expressed in the earliest graves. The way bodies were placed, the objects set beside them, and the careful shaping of soil and stone all reveal how ancient people understood death. Not as a void, but as a passage across prehistoric landscapes. Archaeologists find burials that speak of tenderness and awe. A body might be laid on its side, knees drawn up, as if in sleep. Sometimes food was placed near the hands, as though for a journey. Tools, ornaments, and small figurines accompanied the dead, suggesting that even in the unknown beyond, one would need provisions, protection, or symbols of identity. These gestures show us that death was not seen as an end, but as a continuation, a crossing into another state of being. One of the most striking features of early burials is the use of red ochre. This iron-rich pigment was sprinkled over bodies or painted onto bones. To modern eyes, it is a simple mineral, but to ancient communities, its deep crimson color echoed the lifeblood of existence. Red ochre marked transformation. It was symbolic rebirth, suggesting that from the stillness of the grave, life might stir again. Just as a seed buried in soil bursts forth into green, so too the body buried in earth might awaken in another form. Graves often reveal alignment with the stars or with landscapes of significance. Some burials were oriented toward the rising sun, a symbol of renewal. Others faced sacred mountains, rivers, or horizons that carried mythic meaning. This attention to placement suggests that the dead were not only hidden away, but positioned within a wider cosmic order. Death was woven into the cycles of sky and land. The grave itself became a point of connection between human life and the vast patterns of creation. The silence of burial sites is profound, yet within this silence there is eloquence. The careful choice of grave goods tells us what mattered most. A child buried with beads strung in delicate patterns suggests love, memory, and hope that beauty continued beyond death. A hunter interred with weapons implies the belief that skill and duty endured in the next world. In some burials, entire animals were placed beside the human body, perhaps as companions for the journey, or as sacrifices offered to unseen powers. These rituals reveal early visions of the afterlife. They suggest that death was not a vanishing, but a step across a threshold. The journey may have been imagined as difficult, requiring tools and guidance, or it may have been thought of as a return, a rebirth into a cycle larger than one lifetime. Whatever the exact belief, the consistency of ritual across time and cultures tells us this. Humanity has always struggled to imagine death, not as nothing, but as something. Archaeological discoveries across Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas offer glimpses of this shared language. In Europe, Paleolithic burials at sites like Sungir in Russia reveal bodies dressed with thousands of ivory beads, painstakingly carved and arranged. Such devotion suggests more than ornament. It reflects an understanding that the dead carried significance into eternity. In the Middle East, the Natufians, among the earliest settled communities, buried their dead beneath houses, tying family, soil, and ancestors into one sacred cycle. In Africa, burials such as those at Jebel Sahaba in Sudan show both reverence and the harsh realities of survival. Some graves bear marks of violent conflict, yet even here, the dead were carefully placed, suggesting that dignity was preserved even in times of strife. In the Americas, early mound builders created earthworks that served both as graves and as cosmic symbols, shaping landscapes into monuments of remembrance. Each of these practices, diverse yet resonant, points to the same truth. Burial is not only disposal, but communication. It is a dialogue with the unseen. The living speak to the dead with offerings, and in turn, the dead are imagined as guiding, protecting, or awaiting reunion. We may pause to consider what this reveals about humanity itself. The care invested in burial shows that love extends beyond death. It suggests that grief sought meaning, that mourning turned to ritual as a way of bridging the gap between presence and absence. Burial was not simply about the body. It was about the soul, about continuity, about hope that bonds were not broken forever. The symbolism of graves extends further. To bury a body is to return it to the earth. The soil becomes a womb once more, holding what was once alive, perhaps preparing it for renewal. Just as fields receive seed, so too the ground receives the dead. This parallel between agriculture and burial shaped myths for millennia. The idea that from death comes life, from endings comes beginnings. Silent though they are, graves whisper to us across time. They remind us that death has always invited questions too large for certainty. Where does the spirit go? What lies beyond the last breath? The objects left behind, the colors painted, the directions chosen, all are answers attempted, fragile yet enduring. When we stand before these ancient sites, we feel both distance and kinship. Their world was different, yet their hopes echo ours. They too feared loss. They too longed for continuity. They too wondered if there was something more. Perhaps that is why burial remains one of humanity's most universal rituals. In its silence, it speaks to the eternal longing to connect across the threshold of death. Through grave goods, through ochre, through orientation to stars, people expressed trust that existence does not end with the closing of the eyes. And so, in these early graves, we glimpse the beginnings of theology, of philosophy, of spirituality shaped by grief and reverence. The dead became teachers, not only in memory but in meaning. Their resting places became the first temples, where the living confronted the mystery of mortality and found in it the seeds of belief. The silent language of graves continues to whisper even now. It asks us, softly, if they imagined death as passage, what do we imagine? If they placed offerings for the journey, what offerings do we carry in our own lives? The answers remain uncertain, but the graves, quiet and enduring, remind us that the human spirit has always sought to cross beyond silence into hope. Chapter 7. The Mother Goddess and the Sacred Feminine before gods of thunder and kings of the sky. Before the rise of temples and priests, there was already a figure at the center of human reverence. She was not carved into towering monuments, nor written into scripture at first, but shaped in clay, bone, and stone. She was the mother, the giver of life, the keeper of cycles. The mysterious force that bound the rhythms of the earth to the miracle of birth. Across the earliest settlements of the Neolithic and beyond, archaeologists uncover small figurines, often rounded in form with pronounced hips, breasts, and bellies. These are not portraits of individuals. They are symbols distilled into essence. Fertility, abundance, and the continuity of life were captured in these sacred shapes. The famous Venus figurines, found across Europe and dating back tens of thousands of years, remind us that long before writing, people expressed awe through form. Each carving, whether simple or detailed, was an act of devotion to the feminine principle. Life and birth were among the greatest mysteries. The ability of women to bring forth children seemed nothing less than divine. To ancient eyes, this power mirrored the earth itself, which, when seeded, brought forth crops, fruit, and animals to sustain human communities. The body of woman and the body of earth were seen as reflections of one another. Both carried the potential for life. Both required care, ritual, and gratitude. The mother goddess was therefore more than an image. She was a philosophy. She embodied cycles of creation and return. Just as the moon waxed and waned, just as the fields shifted from sowing to harvest, so too did life move through phases of beginning, flourishing, and ending. The feminine divine expressed this truth in form and presence. She reminded people that creation was not a single act, but an ongoing rhythm. Shrines and offerings reveal the reverence given to her. In Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest known cities of Anatolia, figures of a seated goddess have been found, enthroned with leopards at her sides, suggesting power and protection. In Malta, vast temple complexes, aligned with the stars, were dedicated to a feminine presence that embodied both fertility and cosmic balance. These were not isolated occurrences. Across cultures, the sacred feminine appears, whether in statuettes buried beneath floors, in paintings on cave walls, or in ritual spaces designed to mirror the curves of the womb. The presence of the mother was not only biological, but spiritual. She stood for renewal, for the mystery of origins, for the truth that life emerges from within life. In her, people saw both nurture and awe. She could be gentle, feeding and sustaining, yet she could also be vast, wild and untamed, like the earth that could nourish or withhold. Reverence for the feminine divine was therefore complex. It was gratitude, but also respect for power beyond control. Later myths across civilizations echo these early forms of worship. In Sumer, Inanna embodied fertility, love, and descent into the underworld. In Egypt, Isis carried the role of mother and protector, gathering the pieces of Osiris to restore life. In Greece, Gaia, Demeter, and Hera carried echoes of earlier earth and mother figures. In India, the goddess Devi appears in countless forms, both tender and fierce, embodying the full spectrum of feminine divinity. These later goddesses, clothed in myth and ritual, may trace their roots to the small, rounded figurines of the Neolithic. It is striking that the earliest teacher humanity recognized was not a warrior or a king, but the mother. The feminine principle taught through cycles. She taught that endings give way to beginnings. She showed that life is fragile, but also resilient. Her lesson was not written in texts, but lived in every birth, every harvest, every renewal of season. We might pause to reflect on why the feminine held such centrality in early belief. Perhaps it was because survival itself depended on the forces she represented. Without the fertility of women, communities could not grow. Without the fertility of soil, they could not eat. Without the cycles of earth, life would not continue. To hold these truths in reverence was to recognize the sacredness of existence itself. The sacred feminine also invited reflection on balance. Where there is birth, there is also death. Where there is abundance, there may be scarcity. The mother held both sides of this truth. She was life-giver, yet the earth also receives the dead. She was nurturing, yet nature could also overwhelm. To honor her was to live in awareness of this delicate balance, where gratitude and caution walked side by side, in the quiet of archaeological sites. These small figurines carry immense weight. They are not silent relics, but whispers of memory. They tell us that early humanity understood something profound, that creation is sacred, that cycles govern existence, and that within the feminine lies the mystery of continuity. Even now, the mother goddess lingers in memory. She appears in language, in symbolism, in the persistence of traditions that honor fertility, harvest, and the earth itself. She is present in the figure of Mary in Christianity, in the Black Madonnas of Europe, in the devotion to female saints and healers. She is present in festivals of spring, in rituals of planting, in the ways people still speak of Mother Earth. The sacred feminine may have shifted form through millennia, clothed in new names and images, but her essence endures. She remains a reminder that humanity's first teacher was not distant or abstract. She was embodied, close, woven into daily life. She was the cycle of the moon, the swelling of the belly, the seed in the soil, the child in the arms. And perhaps this is why she continues to resonate. In an age where life feels fragmented, the memory of the Mother Goddess calls us back to cycles, to belonging, to reverence for the sources of life that sustain us all. The figurines, simple yet profound, ask a quiet question that has echoed since the dawn of civilization. If life itself is a gift, do we still live with the reverence that once shaped every offering, every prayer, every gesture toward the sacred feminine? Chapter 8: Ritual circles and community bonds. Long before formal temples and grand edifices, humanity discovered a simple yet profound shape: the circle. In these earliest communities, people gathered not in rows or isolated spaces, but around a common center. The circle became more than geometry. It became a vessel for unity, a reflection of the sky, the sun, and the cycles of time. It held those who stood within it in shared rhythm, and in that rhythm, the foundations of human society and spirituality began to emerge. Rituals, performed within these circles, were not private acts. They were communal, meant to draw people together. Songs and chants rose in layers of voice, weaving a harmony that reflected the invisible order of the cosmos. Movements, steps, and dances followed patterns that echoed celestial cycles or seasonal changes. To step into the circle was to step into a sacred space, where individuality blended with collective purpose, and where the ordinary act of gathering became infused with spiritual meaning. The circle mirrored the sky in its endless curve, just as the sun traced its path across the horizon and the moon glided through the night. So too did the community move together, hand in hand, heart in rhythm. This alignment of human movement with celestial patterns was not accidental. It reflected an early understanding that the well-being of the group, the cycles of harvest, and the flow of life were intertwined. Each ritual was a dialogue between earth and sky, human and divine, individual and community. Bonding rituals held practical as well as spiritual significance. By performing together, early people reinforced cooperation and harmony. Shared work and shared worship became inseparable. Survival in challenging environments required cohesion, and rituals strengthened trust, empathy, and mutual understanding. The circle, in its silent symbolism, was a visual and physical affirmation of this unity. Those who gathered within it acknowledged that no one person could thrive alone, that life was a communal tapestry, woven from the strands of many hands, voices, and hearts. Chants and songs served as more than artistic expression. They were vessels of memory, carrying knowledge, history, and guidance across generations. Stories of ancestors, of the cycles of the seasons, and of divine forces were embedded in rhythm and melody. Dancing in circles allowed individuals to participate in these narratives, embodying lessons through motion and breath. The act of moving together in time reinforced not only coordination but an awareness of shared existence. Every step taken in unison was both celebration and affirmation of connection. The circle also offered a reflection of cosmic wholeness. Its unbroken form suggested completeness, infinity, and continuity. Those who gathered within it could imagine themselves part of a larger order, where life's smallest acts were aligned with forces beyond sight. The ritual circle became a living map, a microcosm of nature's patterns, where every gesture mirrored a celestial or seasonal rhythm. In standing together, humans learned that their lives were not isolated episodes, but threads within a broader, eternal fabric. Even in silence, the circle held meaning. Moments without song or movement were still sacred. In stillness, the community felt presence, the presence of the earth beneath, the sky above, the ancestors who had come before, and the unseen forces that guided growth and survival. Silence became an essential element of the ritual, a space in which reflection and awareness could arise. The circle was not merely a gathering of bodies, but a convergence of attention, intention, and reverence. Early religion, then, was never solitary. It was woven into the social fabric, inseparable from the bonds that allowed people to live, thrive, and endure. The circle symbolized more than ritual. It symbolized trust, interdependence, and recognition of shared fate. Those who took part understood that their actions influenced one another, and that the well-being of the community was intertwined with respect for each participant, for nature, and for the forces beyond human sight, in every corner of the world. Evidence of these ritual spaces endures. Archaeological sites show circular arrangements of stones, posts, or pits. They hint at the songs sung, the dances performed, and the stories shared. In Europe, timber circles trace the early imagination of sacred gathering. In Africa and the Americas, circular arrangements marked spaces for feasting, prayer, and social unity. Across cultures, the shape persisted, reminding us that the circle is one of humanity's oldest spiritual instruments, a form that organizes both space and thought. Through these communal acts, early humans learned the power of presence. Being together, witnessing one another, participating in shared rhythm, they discovered that the sacred was not only in objects or offerings, but in the act of connection itself. Each gathering reinforced not only social cohesion, but a sense of belonging in the universe. To participate in the circle was to acknowledge the invisible threads linking life, nature, and the unseen. And so, the ritual circle was more than a physical shape. It was a teacher. It taught that unity is sacred, that the strength of a people lies in cooperation and awareness of one another, and that the rhythms of life are reflected in shared experience. Each gathering, each dance, each chant was a step in understanding that humanity's earliest spirituality was inseparable from the bonds that held communities together. Even now, echoes of this practice persist. The memory of shared circles can be seen in traditions of festival, feast, and dance around the world. Even today, when people stand in circles for celebration, ceremony, or contemplation, they honor a very old truth, that presence together is a sacred act, and that communion with one another is as vital as communion with the divine. In the quiet imagination of history, we may ask ourselves, if the circle is a mirror of sky, time, and human connection, Do we still recognize the sacredness of gathering? Do we still honor the invisible threads that bind us, as they once did, through song, dance, and shared intention? The answers are not given, but the circle remains. Its silent form continues to teach, quietly, that unity and reverence are not merely ideals, but lived experiences shaped by rhythm, presence, and shared life. Chapter 9: Animal Spirits and the Shaman's Journey Long Before Domesticated Herds or Penned Livestock. Humans lived among animals in a delicate balance of survival and reverence. Every hunt carried necessity, but also respect. The creatures that provided food were more than sustenance. They were teachers, guides, and symbols of the unseen. In this understanding, early humans recognized that life was woven with threads, both visible and invisible, where the spirit of the hunted could linger, influencing dreams, rituals, and the imagination of the community. Shamans emerged as mediators between the human and animal worlds. They were not rulers, but guides, moving fluidly between what was seen and what was felt. In their journeys, often facilitated by trance, drumming, or rhythmic dance, shamans communicated with animal spirits. These encounters were not fanciful. They were structured acts of attention and reverence, aimed at maintaining balance. The shaman learned from the strength of the bear, the keen sight of the eagle, or the silent patience of the deer, and in turn, taught the people to live in harmony with the natural order. Animal bones were treated with particular care. Hunters did not simply discard remains after a kill. Certain bones were preserved as sacred relics, kept in dwellings or ritual spaces. These relics were reminders of connection and reciprocity, acknowledgement that the gift of life demanded gratitude. Some were carved or decorated, signaling recognition of the power and wisdom inherent in each creature. These preserved elements became tangible bridges between worlds, allowing humans to touch the sacred even in ordinary survival practices. Ritual dances often embodied the soul of the beasts themselves. Participants mimicked movements, sounds, and behaviors, seeking not only to honor the animals, but to internalize their qualities. The mimicry was more than performance. It was embodiment, a way to absorb the skill, courage, and spirit of other beings. In these dances, humans experienced themselves as part of a greater web, where mastery was measured not in conquest but in understanding. The line between hunter and hunted blurred, replaced by recognition of mutual presence and mutual significance. The shamans transacted as a bridge between worlds. In these altered states, guided by rhythm, solitude, or meditation, shamans traveled beyond the visible landscape. They visited realms inhabited by animal spirits, ancestors, and unseen forces. These journeys were both personal and communal. Messages returned from the spirit world guided hunting, healing, and community decisions. Shamans were not seers alone. They were interpreters of patterns, conduits of wisdom, and teachers of respect for life in all its forms. Totemic beliefs arose naturally from these experiences. Certain clans, families, or individuals identified with specific animals, embracing them as protectors, guides, or ancestral figures. The wolf, the eagle, the salmon, each animal carried distinct qualities and lessons. Totems became mnemonic devices for morality, survival, and spiritual growth. They reminded communities of their responsibilities, both to the natural world and to one another. In seeing themselves reflected in animal spirits, humans discovered aspects of their own power, vulnerability, and potential. Animals, in this worldview, were never merely passive. They were active participants in myth and ritual. Stories of clever foxes, brave lions, and cunning serpents were not merely entertainment. They encoded wisdom, survival strategies, and ethical principles. Through these tales, humans learned about cunning, courage, patience, and cooperation. Each myth was a dialogue between the human imagination and the patterns observed in nature. Lessons were drawn, internalized, and ritualized. The bond between humans and animals shaped early spirituality in profound ways. The natural world was alive with meaning, and each act of hunting, tracking, or observing was also an act of spiritual engagement. Humans learned to read signs, interpret tracks, and recognize the rhythms of seasons, not only for survival, but as sacred practice. Respect for animal life was embedded in daily action and ritual. The land itself became a classroom where the movements, habits, and spirits of creatures taught enduring lessons. This intimate relationship continues to resonate in later religious and cultural traditions. Animism, totemism, and shamanism left traces in global mythologies. In some indigenous cultures today, animal spirits guide rituals, healing, and ethical teaching. Even modern imagination carries echoes of these earliest practices, from folklore to literature, reminding us that humans have long sought wisdom in the movements of creatures both near and distant. Perhaps the most remarkable insight is how early humans recognized interdependence. They hunted, yet honored. They dwelt among predators and prey, yet acknowledged the intelligence and spirit of each. In doing so, they cultivated humility and insight. Power was not measured in domination, but in understanding. The shaman, the ritual, the totem, all serve to remind communities that life is sustained by respect, observation, and dialogue with the unseen. As we imagine these early ceremonies, we may sense the rhythm of feet moving in circle, the echoes of drum beats, the flicker of torchlight across bone and stone. We may hear the calls of the wild, the whispers of animal spirits, and the guidance of shamans moving between worlds. The past is not silent. It communicates in movement, form, and ritual. It invites reflection on how humans have always sought connection with each other, with the natural world, and with the currents of life that extend beyond immediate perception. In this silent, enduring way, the animals became more than companions or resources. They were teachers, guardians, and symbols of what humans might become if they attuned themselves to the rhythms of life. And as we trace these ancient practices, we are reminded that to honor the animal spirit is to honor the delicate balance that sustains existence, a balance that continues to whisper its lessons. Even today, the shaman's journey teaches us that life and spirit are intertwined. It asks quietly if early humans saw wisdom and power reflected in every creature. What might we learn by observing, listening, and honoring the living world around us now? Chapter 10: Rivers, Springs, and the Sacred Waters from the Earliest Days. Humans understood water as more than a necessity. It was life itself, the medium through which growth, survival, and the unfolding of the natural world occurred. Streams and rivers nourished fields, sustained herds, and offered drinks to both people and beasts. Yet water held a deeper significance. It was a mirror of existence, reflecting the skies, carrying stories from mountains to oceans, and symbolizing the ceaseless passage of time. Its presence suggested both clarity and mystery, inviting reverence as a force that sustained and transformed all life. Springs, bubbling quietly from the earth, became focal points for ritual attention. They were places of renewal, where the living world seemed to emerge directly from the hidden heart of the planet. Communities often considered these sources sacred, leaving offerings of grain, stone, or carved tokens, gestures of gratitude and acknowledgement. In these acts, people honored both the water's physical gift and its spiritual resonance. To approach a spring was to enter a liminal space, a threshold where the ordinary and the sacred touched, where one could sense the pulse of life beneath the surface of everyday activity. Rivers shaped not only the landscape, but also the imagination. Settlements clustered along their banks, drawn by water's practicality, yet aware of its symbolic significance. Meandering waters became routes of travel, lifelines for trade and communication, and sites for ceremonial gatherings. Offerings cast into flowing streams carried intentions downstream, allowing humans to participate in a dialogue with forces they could not fully perceive. The movement of water became a metaphor for continuity and change, a reminder that life, like the river, flows unceasingly, shaping and reshaping the contours of existence. Water rituals were closely tied to fertility. Communities recognized that the health of the land, the success of crops, and the vitality of people depended on the presence and purity of flowing water. Ceremonies often involved washing, immersion, or the casting of symbolic objects into rivers, reflecting both gratitude and hope. Through these acts, humans acknowledged a profound interconnection, that their survival, prosperity, and spiritual life were inseparable from the waters that moved through and around them. Yet not all water was swift and flowing. Ponds, pools, and quiet stretches of river offered reflection, stillness, and peace. In the calm surface of these waters, humans could see not only their own image, but the reflection of the sky, trees, and seasons. Such stillness became a tool for contemplation, a space in which the mind could pause, the heart could settle, and attention could turn inward. The quiet of a pond mirrored inner tranquility, teaching that sacred experience was not only found in grand currents, but also in patience, observation, and the gentle passing of time. Water also acted as a threshold between worlds. Streams, rivers, and wetlands often demarcated spaces of transition, the edge of a village, the border of hunting grounds, or the entry into territories imbued with spiritual meaning. In ritual contexts, crossing or engaging with water symbolized movement between life and death, the mundane and the divine. Water became a medium for storytelling, a silent narrator that traced journeys, carried prayers, and whispered secrets of creation. Its flow suggested eternity, a quiet insistence that life moves, transforms, and returns, ever circulating in cycles, both visible and hidden. The sacredness of water was reflected in diverse practices across civilizations. In early Neolithic communities, offerings were often left at riverbanks or in later cultures, rivers became central to festivals, processions, and pilgrimages. Myths frequently cast rivers and lakes as dwellings of spirits, guardians of fertility, or thresholds to other realms. Across these contexts, the underlying understanding remained constant. Water is life, water is spirit, and engagement with it requires respect, mindfulness, and gratitude. Water's lessons are subtle yet enduring. It teaches that life is never static, that nourishment is a gift, and that renewal is continuous. It embodies patience and persistence, as streams carve valleys and rivers shape mountains over generations. It carries memory and history in sediment and current. For early humans, Participation in water rituals was not mere ceremony. It was an acknowledgement of dependence, a practice of reverence, and a moment of intimate connection with forces far greater than themselves. Even today, the quiet presence of a stream or the glimmer of a pond invites reflection. We may not cast offerings as the earliest peoples did, yet the act of pausing by water, noticing its motion, or listening to its gentle murmur continues to connect us with the rhythms of life. Water reminds us of cycles we cannot always control, yet can learn to honor growth and decay, movement and stillness, emergence and return in observing these sacred waters. One can imagine the hands that once released grains or stones into the currents, the prayers murmured in the hush of early mornings, the deep awareness of humans who understood that survival and spirituality were inseparable. Water remains a threshold, a teacher, and a mirror, both of the world around us and the world within. And so, rivers, springs, and still ponds continue to whisper their lessons. Their flow suggests that life, in all its forms, carries a rhythm we are invited to notice, honor, and join. They ask gently, how do we move through our own currents, and where do we leave offerings of gratitude in our journey through the unfolding world? Chapter 11: Sky, Stars, and the Celestial Calendar. Long before clocks and calendars, humans turned their gaze upward, seeking meaning in the sweep of the sky. Night after night, stars appeared as silent witnesses to the passage of time, their constellations tracing patterns that echoed across the imagination. The heavens became both a practical guide and a sacred canvas. People observed their movement carefully, noting which stars rose at planting season, which faded with the harvest, and which marked the cycles of life, death, and renewal. In this attention, the sky was no longer distant or indifferent. It was intimate, a teacher of rhythm, order, and the subtle flow of existence. The stars were guides not only for survival, but for ritual. Early agricultural societies depended on celestial markers to determine sowing and reaping. Yet beyond this practicality, stars carried spiritual weight. Certain formations were thought to embody ancestors, spirits, or deities, their light a bridge between worlds. By following these luminous paths, humans connected with forces larger than themselves, understanding their place within a vast and unfolding cosmos. Observing the night sky became a meditative act, a way to align human life with the movements of the universe. Lunar cycles further structured the rhythm of ritual. The waxing and waning of the moon influenced planting, hunting, and ceremonial life. Festivals and offerings were timed to coincide with particular phases, acknowledging that the world operates in cycles of increase and decline, presence and absence. The moon's changing face offered both practical guidance and a subtle reminder that all life is transient, yet recurring. Its light, gentle and consistent, illuminated the sacred spaces of early villages, casting reflection on ponds, fields, and the faces of those who watched the sky. Solar phenomena inspired awe and creativity. The solstices, moments when the sun reached its highest or lowest point in the sky, were observed with care and often commemorated with monuments and stone arrangements. These alignments linked earth and sky in enduring patterns, demonstrating an awareness of movement and order that continues to astonish archaeologists today. Such constructions were more than markers. They were prayers in stone, acknowledging the sun's life-giving presence and embedding cosmic awareness into the very landscape. Communities gathered to witness these events, observing the turning of time with ritual, song, and silent contemplation. The sky, in many ways, became a vast sacred text. Its constellations, comets, and planetary movements were read as stories, histories, and guides. Myths were traced in stars, encoding lessons about morality, survival, and human behavior. Heroes, animals, and deities were placed among the constellations, creating a celestial library that could be read without words. These myths served as both entertainment and instruction, reminding humans that their actions, though fleeting, were part of a greater cosmic order. By embedding meaning in the heavens, early peoples affirmed that the universe itself was a canvas of intelligence and care. The heavens gave structure and order to earthly life. Time, once perceived only through the rhythms of crops and seasons, was now mapped against an eternal backdrop. The rising and setting of celestial bodies offered markers for ceremony, celebration, and reflection. In aligning human activities with celestial patterns, early societies cultivated a sense of harmony, understanding that human rhythms are part of a larger, enduring cycle. This perception instilled both humility and awe, suggesting that life is guided by forces both predictable and mysterious, measurable yet profound. Observing the sky was not a solitary act. It brought communities together, uniting observers in shared wonder and reflection. Collective attention to celestial events reinforced social bonds, teaching cooperation, memory, and the communal passage of knowledge. Children learned the stories of constellations from elders, absorbing lessons of courage, endurance, and virtue. Rituals aligned with lunar phases or solstices became communal experiences, reminding participants of their interconnectedness with each other, the land, and the cosmos. Even as modern tools allow us to measure time with precision, the wonder that prompted early humans to chart the sky remains accessible. When one pauses to watch the night unfold, to notice the slow rotation of stars, or the gentle glow of the moon, one can sense the same curiosity, reverence, and desire for alignment that guided ancient observers. The sky continues to remind us of rhythms beyond our immediate control, of cycles that shape life and shape the imagination. In the celestial patterns of the past, we glimpse an enduring truth that humans have always sought to understand their place in the universe, to trace meaning in the stars, and to harmonize their lives with the movements of forces larger than themselves. The heavens, in all their vastness, offer both guidance and reflection, encouraging stillness, observation, and a deep awareness of continuity. Time itself, measured in light and shadow, became divine, and in this realization, humans discovered that the cosmos is not only around them, but within them, echoing in rhythm with their own breath and heartbeat. The stars, in their quiet constancy, whisper that life is part of a greater story, and invite us to consider how might we, too, attune ourselves to the rhythms of the sky, and allow the eternal movement of time to illuminate our inner world. Chapter 12. Masks, Dances, and Sacred Performance from the Earliest Communities. Humans discovered that expression could bridge the seen and unseen. Masks, crafted from wood, clay, and bone, were more than decoration. They were vessels of transformation, enabling the wearer to step beyond the ordinary self and inhabit the essence of spirits, ancestors, or deities. In donning a mask, a person became more than human. Their gestures, voice, and presence were infused with the power of another being. The mask allowed a temporary release from personal identity, opening a space where the sacred could move freely among the living. Dancers accompanied these transformations, embodying stories and emotions that words could not contain. Ritual movement, often accompanied by music or chant, became a shared language. Drums echoed the heartbeat, linking performers and audience to the rhythm of the earth itself. Steps and gestures were not mere entertainment. They were acts of devotion, gestures of alignment with cosmic cycles, and a way to honor both life and the unseen forces that shaped it. Through dance, communities felt the pulse of the sacred, moving together in a rhythm that reinforced bonds, acknowledged mysteries, and celebrated continuity. Performance in these early rituals carried deep layers of meaning. It was a sacred drama in which humans enacted stories of creation, survival, and moral guidance. Heroes, gods, and animals appeared through gestures and movement, making myth tangible. The stage was often the open earth, the circle of the village, or the shadowed interior of a cave. Within these spaces, every motion had intent, every pause held significance, and silence itself became a statement. Participants and observers alike were drawn into a shared experience, feeling the story with their whole being. Masks and dancers were instruments of transformation, not only for the community but for the individual. Wearing a mask allowed the performer to inhabit courage, wisdom, or ferocity, qualities revered or necessary within the culture. Movements mimicked animals, celestial bodies, or elemental forces, turning human bodies into living symbols. In this way, ritual performance became a conduit for understanding the world, for embodying the mysteries of life, death, and the divine, and for experiencing them as immediate, tangible phenomena. Music and rhythm deepened the sacred effect. Percussion, wind instruments, and vocalizations provided a backdrop that shaped perception, inducing states of focused attention, trance, or reflection. The repetition of sound mirrored the cycles observed in nature, the turning of the seasons, the flow of water, the rising and setting of the sun. Through these patterns, the community felt the resonance of life itself, and the dancer became both messenger and mediator between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Communal participation reinforced bonds and shared understanding. Ritual theater was never only a performance to be watched. It was an experience to be felt collectively. The energy of one participant influenced another, creating a network of shared emotion, attention, and memory. Through these enactments, knowledge was passed down across generations, embedding values, cosmologies, and practices in embodied experience rather than only in words. The sacred, then, was not a distant abstraction but a living, breathing presence woven into the fabric of daily life. Even silence held weight within these ritual spaces. Pauses in movement, stillness between beats, or moments of gaze toward the sky carried meaning as potent as any gesture. Silence became a sacred counterpoint to motion, allowing reflection, attention, and the recognition of forces beyond human control. Within this interplay of sound, movement, and stillness, early humans explored the boundaries between self and spirit, the known and unknown, the earthly and divine. Masks, dances, and sacred performances were not mere art. They were tools for understanding, connection, and transformation. They allowed humans to experience the world with heightened awareness, to enter myth and emerge with new insight, and to feel the presence of powers greater than themselves. These practices seeded the earliest forms of theater, ritual, and communal spirituality, demonstrating that expression can become both devotion and meditation, art and prayer, through the masks and movements of ancient ceremonies. we glimpse the careful attention early humans paid to the invisible threads that connect life, spirit, and community. The sacred was enacted, lived, and felt, and we might ask ourselves, as we imagine these ceremonies in silence, how might the rhythm of our own movements, gestures, and presence carry the sacred, even in the quiet moments of our daily lives? Chapter 13. The silent power of stone tools, from the earliest villages to the vast plains of human settlement. Stone shaped more than survival. Axes, blades, and scrapers were not simply instruments of labor. They carried meaning, intention, and a subtle, sacred force. When a hand lifted a polished tool, it was not merely preparing to cut wood or carve flesh. It was connecting with the enduring presence of stone itself, a material both humble and eternal, steadfast amid the fleeting nature of human life. Stone tools were intimate companions in daily existence. They guided hands, channeled energy, and marked human ingenuity. Yet beyond their practical use, they were objects of reverence. In burials, polished stones were offered alongside the deceased, suggesting that these implements were more than utility. They were symbols of skill, endurance, and connection. Placed carefully beside a loved one, they became silent witnesses to life and markers of passage. They spoke of respect for labor, of gratitude for provision, and of acknowledgement that human effort itself could be sacred. The permanence of stone contrasted with the fragility of flesh. Where life was transient, stone endured. This juxtaposition was not lost on early communities. Each tool, shaped by repeated strikes and patient shaping, embodied the time, effort, and intention of its maker. In its form, weight, and edge, it carried memory. Every cut in a tree, every scrape on animal hide, every carved groove was an act of continuity, an extension of human presence into the world. Stone became a bridge between the ephemeral and the enduring, a quiet witness to human toil and devotion. Ornaments carved from stone further illustrate this interplay between function and meaning. Beads, pendants, and engraved figurines were not merely decorative. They carried the essence of ritual and symbolism. Wearing or handling these objects connected the living to ancestors, to the cycles of work and life, and to the broader mysteries of the world. Through stone, humans expressed gratitude, sought protection, and marked identity. Every polished edge, every intricate groove, was an act of reverent intention. Stone tools also mediated rhythm and focus. The repetitive strikes required to shape a blade or grind a pigment became almost meditative, drawing the maker into a focused state where thought, effort, and spirit intertwined. In this process, labor was elevated into ritual, and the simplest of tasks became an engagement with both material and meaning. Hands and stone met, shaping each other as much as they shaped the world. In this quiet interaction, the ordinary became sacred, and the tool itself gained a life beyond its utility. Communities recognized that these implements connected them to a larger sense of time and heritage. A stone blade used for generations carried the marks of ancestors, each nick and polish a story of continuity. Tools became relics of memory, enduring in ways that flesh and fleeting experience could not. Their presence in daily life, in ritual, and in burial spoke of a subtle spiritual intelligence. The recognition that human effort, when combined with patience, intention, and care, could echo beyond a single lifetime. Stone was both companion and teacher. Its hardness demanded respect, its permanence reminded of eternity. and its form reflected the skill and insight of its maker. Every cut, scrape, and carve was an expression of knowledge, an offering to both community and cosmos. Through these tools, early humans discovered that even the simplest object could carry layers of meaning, binding work, devotion, and continuity into one quiet, enduring presence, even now. When we look upon ancient stone tools in museums or in excavations, their silent power persists. They remind us that human life is fleeting, yet intention and care can create echoes that outlast a single generation. They invite reflection on the ways we shape the world and how the materials around us carry the traces of our labor, our reverence, and our desire to leave something lasting behind. Perhaps the true power of stone lies not in its hardness, but in the patience, attention, and respect it teaches. In its quiet permanence, it asks us to consider how the simplest tools, the daily labors, and the small acts of care can resonate far beyond their immediate purpose. And in that resonance, we find the enduring presence of human hands reaching toward meaning, just as they always have. Chapter 14: Blood, Life, and Sacrifice in the Early Minden, the Earliest Human Communities. Life itself was a precious and mysterious gift. The rhythm of survival, the hunt, the harvest, and the nurturing of young revealed the fragility and fleeting nature of existence. It is here, in this awareness, that the earliest expressions of sacrifice emerged. Life was given, not recklessly, but as a deliberate offering. In these acts, humanity began to sense a connection between the tangible and the unseen, between the material and the spiritual. Animal sacrifice became the first language of this understanding. Hunters did not kill merely to feed the body. They acknowledged the spirit of the creatures they relied upon. Blood, the vital essence, was recognized as more than a substance. It carried the life force itself. Its release was an offering, a bridge between the human and the sacred, a moment of reciprocity in which life was both honored and returned. In these acts, early communities recognized the fragility of existence and the responsibility inherent in taking life for survival. The act of sacrifice was woven into daily and seasonal life. Rituals marked by offerings of blood, or even symbolic gestures, carried intention and reverence. Every movement, every placement of an animal or symbolic object reflected awareness of unseen forces, of the balance required to maintain harmony with the natural and spiritual worlds. These were not acts of fear or coercion, but of recognition, acknowledging that life, in all its forms, demanded respect. Over time, these practices became more formalized, yet their roots lie in this intimate understanding of reciprocity. Early humans sensed that giving life, even in the smallest way, was an act of cosmic conversation. The hunters and gatherers of distant ages understood that survival depended on a continuous dialogue with the world around them, and that dialogue was expressed through the sacred act of offering. Blood became a symbol, not of violence alone, but of vitality, of the gift inherent in all living beings. Sacrifice was not limited to animals. Offerings could take many forms: the first fruits of a harvest, the carefully crafted objects placed in shrines, or even symbolic gestures of devotion. Each act reflected awareness that human life was part of a larger web. The giving of something precious signified acknowledgement of forces beyond the immediate, a recognition that existence itself was intertwined with the sacred. The perception of blood as a bridge between realms carried profound implications. It was a language without words, a recognition that life and death, giving and receiving, were bound together in cycles. Early people sensed that in offering the vital essence of one creature, or even the fruits of their labor, they participated in a rhythm that sustained both human and cosmic order. Life given in this way was both fearsome and holy, a tension that taught reverence and humility. Sacrificial rites also served as communal acts, binding members of a group together in shared understanding and purpose. Witnessing and participating in these ceremonies created a sense of belonging, a reminder that human life was inseparable from the life of the group and the forces that shaped the world. The rituals instilled awareness, respect, and a profound recognition of dependence not only on one another, but on the living world that sustained them. Though the specifics of these early rites evolved over time, the underlying principle remained constant. Life is sacred, and offering a part of it is an acknowledgement of connection. Sacrifice was never merely functional. It was a dialogue with existence itself. The reverence embedded in these acts shaped myth, ritual, and the earliest conceptions of morality and justice. It reflected an intuitive understanding of balance between giving and taking, life and death, human and spirit. Even today, as we encounter the remnants of these practices in archaeological records, myths, and oral traditions, their resonance persists. The silent understanding that life must be respected, that giving and receiving are intertwined, speaks across millennia. It reminds us that humanity's earliest spiritual expressions were rooted in awareness of fragility, intention, and connection. Blood, life, and sacrifice formed a sacred language that shaped thought, ritual, and reverence long before temples or written texts appeared. Perhaps the deepest lesson of these early sacrifices lies not in the acts themselves, but in the consciousness they evoked, the recognition that every life is precious, every gesture of giving carries meaning, and every participation in the sacred cycle leaves an imprint upon the world. In reflecting on this, one might wonder, in what ways does the simple act of respect, the mindful offering of our own attention or care, continue to echo the earliest understandings of life's sacredness? Chapter 15: Music, Chant, and the Echo of Sacred Sound. Long before written language, sound was the vessel of memory and meaning. The first instruments, simple flutes carved from bone, percussive drums fashioned from wood and hide, were not merely tools for entertainment. They shaped sacred space, transforming ordinary moments into encounters with the unseen. Music moved beyond the ear. It touched the body, resonated with the heartbeat, and stirred the collective spirit of the group. In this way, early communities discovered the profound power of sound. Chanting became a common thread in ritual life. Words, repeated in rhythm, created a bridge between human consciousness and something larger, something ineffable. The very act of vocalization, the rise and fall of collective voices, induced a trance-like awareness. In these moments, participants felt simultaneously grounded and expanded, rooted in the circle, yet lifted toward realms beyond the tangible. Music and chant became conduits for devotion, awareness, and communal cohesion. Drums, with their steady pulse, mirrored both the earth and the human heart. They created a temporal framework, a rhythm that structured movement, thought, and ritual. Each strike was a call to presence, a heartbeat shared among all present. In tandem with chants or flutes, percussion established a sacred dialogue, a conversation in which sound itself carried the weight of reverence. Flutes and wind instruments carried melody, weaving intricate patterns that transcended words. The breath became sacred, each note an offering of life. These early sounds told stories, encoded myth, and preserved memory. Across generations, music functioned as both a record and a vessel, transmitting knowledge, belief, and collective identity in a form that could be felt as much as understood. The architecture of space amplified the mystery of sound. Caves, with their natural resonance, turned a single voice into a chorus. Drums echoed off stone walls, flutes reverberated in hidden hollows, and chants multiplied in the stillness. In these acoustically alive spaces, sound itself became a partner in ritual, extending beyond the human body to engage the surrounding environment. Music, in this sense, was both inside and outside the self-an experience that merged nature, body, and spirit. Silence, too, held sacred meaning. The absence of sound framed the music, highlighted the ritual's intent, and created space for reflection. In the interplay of note and pause, humans perceived the fullness of presence. Every silence was intentional, as meaningful as the sounds that preceded and followed it. It was in these quiet intervals that early humans sensed the subtle, ineffable qualities of the sacred and awareness that life itself carried rhythms, pauses, and echoes beyond immediate perception. Music also functioned as a medium for teaching and continuity. Myths, genealogies, and cosmologies were encoded in repeated chants and melodies. Young members of the community learned not only the stories themselves, but the rhythms and cadences through which those stories gained their power. Memory became inseparable from sound. Knowledge was carried on breath, in vibration, in resonance. Every note connected body and soul, imprinting cultural wisdom into lived experience. Ritual sound extended beyond formal ceremony. Daily labor, the tending of fields, or preparation of meals could be accompanied by song. Work and devotion intertwined, illustrating the understanding that sound, rhythm, and voice were inseparable from life itself, even in solitude. A hum or a whispered chant could maintain connection with ancestors, spirits, and the cycles of nature. The universality of early musical practice suggests an intuitive recognition. The world itself is a symphony. Water flowing, wind rustling through trees. The cracking of fire-rich natural sound was heard as music, each pulse a rhythm to which humans could attune. Through instruments and voice, humans learned to echo these rhythms, to participate consciously in the natural harmony surrounding them. Music was a reflection, a mirror of cosmic order, and a means to align human perception with the greater pattern of existence. In every chant, drumbeat, and flute melody, early humans discovered the inseparability of body, mind, and spirit. Music shaped ritual, guided consciousness, and created communal unity. It was a bridge, linking human life with forces both immediate and transcendent. In its echoes, the sacred became tangible, perceptible, and profoundly intimate. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from these early sounds is the reminder that presence is amplified through attention. Music, in its most primal form, required awareness of both self and others, of sound and silence, of movement and stillness. It revealed the subtle interconnections that structure life, the invisible threads binding community, nature, and the unseen. Listening to music, even in its simplest forms, became an act of communion, a recognition of life's rhythms and the echoes of the sacred dot in the quiet that follows. One can imagine those first voices and flutes resonating across stone and earth, reaching beyond the individual into the collective heart. The echo of sacred sound is not lost. It persists in memory, in rhythm, in the enduring awareness that life itself is composed of pulse, vibration, and reverence. Music was, and remains, the human bridge to mystery. Chapter 16: Dreams, Visions, and the Spirit World. Long before written records, humans sought understanding through the world of dreams. Sleep was not a pause from life, but a passage into another realm, a space where the ordinary boundaries of time, body, and perception became fluid. Dreams were considered portals, brief openings into the unseen, where guidance, warning, and inspiration could emerge. For Neolithic people, the night was alive with meaning. Each vision carried the weight of a message, a subtle instruction from forces beyond immediate perception. Night visions guided both decisions and ritual practice. Hunters, gatherers, and early farmers alike paid attention to the images that appeared during slumber. Shapes of animals, shifting landscapes, or encounters with ancestors were not dismissed as mere imaginings. Instead, they were interpreted with care, for these visions held insight into survival, communal well-being, and spiritual alignment. Dreams revealed patterns of the natural world, cycles of growth and decline, and glimpses of forces that shaped life itself. Recognized as mediators between the material and spirit worlds, were particularly attuned to the language of dreams. They could interpret symbolic journeys, translating the often cryptic imagery into practical and spiritual guidance. A dream of a river, for instance, might indicate abundance, danger, or a passage in life. Encounters with animals could signify protection, power, or lessons yet to be understood. The shaman's role was to bridge these worlds, to transform vision into knowledge, and to guide the community in alignment with the unseen. Dreams also carried ancestral voices. In the quiet darkness, the living could sense the presence of those who had passed, the continuity of wisdom spanning generations. These nocturnal encounters reinforced connection, memory, and belonging. The ancestors spoke through symbols, patterns, and emotions, their voices embedded in the landscapes of the mind. To dream was to step into a conversation that extended far beyond the immediate, into the heart of collective experience and ancestral memory. The dream state itself was a sacred gift. It was a time when ordinary rules were suspended, when human consciousness could touch both the tangible and intangible. Rituals of sleep, often intertwined with meditation, fasting, or ceremonial preparation, enhanced these experiences. Participants entered dreams with intention, inviting guidance, insight, or communion with spirit. Night became a teacher, offering lessons in subtlety, patience, and the unseen currents that underlie life. Even solitary dreams were part of communal understanding. Individuals would recount their visions, sharing messages, warnings, or insights. Through this exchange, the spiritual and practical knowledge of the group expanded. Dream interpretation became a shared art, a language of symbolism and intuition that allowed communities to navigate the uncertainties of survival and existence. In this way, dreams were not only personal experiences, but collective threads linking people to one another and to the broader world of spirits. Spirit and dream intertwined seamlessly in Neolithic life. Just as the seasons shaped work and ritual, the night shaped thought and imagination. Dreams could influence planting and harvesting, hunting strategies, or the timing of ceremonies. They offered insight into relationships, conflict, and potential alliances with both human and non-human forces. In the silence of night, humans listened, interpreted, and responded, understanding that the invisible world was as consequential as the visible one. symbols and dreams were deeply significant. Animals, celestial movements, flowing water, and shifting landscapes often recurred in vision. Each carried layers of meaning, sometimes immediate and practical, other times spiritual and philosophical. The interpretation of these symbols required attentiveness, memory, and sensitivity to subtle patterns. Dreaming became a discipline, a way to attune oneself to the rhythms of life that were otherwise imperceptible during waking hours. Ritual sleep, as practiced in some early societies, invited direct interaction with the divine. Participants might sleep in sacred spaces, near fires, under specific stones, or within circles aligned to celestial markers. These environments were believed to enhance the receptivity of the dreamer, to encourage encounters with guiding spirits, and to facilitate transformative experiences. The line between ritual and dream was porous, allowing the sacred to permeate even the most private hours of rest. Through the lens of modern understanding, we recognize the universality of dreams. Yet in the Neolithic world, they carried tangible significance. Choices of daily life, strategies for survival, and the timing of community events were informed by the insights gained in vision. Dreams shaped not only beliefs but behavior, creating a feedback loop between the seen and unseen, the conscious and subconscious, life and the mysterious forces that hovered just beyond perception. Dreams reminded humans of their vulnerability and their connection. They revealed that life is guided not only by immediate actions, but by subtle currents that defy full control. In the dream world, boundaries blur, the living converse with ancestors. The human recognizes kinship with animals, and the ordinary landscape becomes a map of spiritual significance. Sleep and vision together offered a practice in humility, attention, and reverence for the unseen dimensions of existence. Perhaps what lingers most in considering these early practices is the realization that dreams were a language of symbols, emotion, and intuition that connected individuals to their community, their ancestors, and the natural world. In dreams, early humans engaged with questions that transcended the immediate, the origins of life, the cycles of growth and decay, the presence of forces beyond comprehension. Each dream was both intimate and universal, personal yet communal, fleeting yet echoing across time. The night, with its darkness and quiet, was a sanctuary. Its lessons were subtle, requiring patience, reflection, and listening. In this space, humans encountered mystery directly, learning to interpret the voices of spirit, the messages of the unseen, and the guidance encoded in symbolic visions. Dreams were an early form of sacred dialogue, a practice of engaging with the mysteries of life and existence itself. In the end, the Neolithic understanding of dreams reminds us that consciousness extends beyond the body and the immediate. To dream was to participate in a wider conversation, to touch the intangible, and to receive guidance from forces larger than oneself. Spirit and vision were inseparable. Night became a mirror reflecting the depths of life, and the human mind became both vessel and interpreter. Dreams, then, were more than images. They were teachings, reminders, and enduring connections to the sacred. Chapter 17. The sacred role of ancestors. Long before structured religions or written doctrines, humans turned to the memory of those who came before them. Ancestors were more than family. They were guardians of life, protectors of the hearth, and keepers of accumulated wisdom. Their presence was felt in daily life, in the rhythm of planting and harvest, in the movements of animals, and in the cycles of the seasons. To honor ancestors was to acknowledge that life is not an isolated journey but a continuum, a thread that binds the living to those who walked the earth before. Physical remnants of the past, the bones of forebears, ritual relics, or objects of personal significance were often kept near living spaces. These items were treated with care as tangible connections to spirits that could guide, warn, or bless. A fragment of bone, a polished stone, or a carved ornament was more than material. It was a conduit through which ancestral presence could flow. The living understood that the unseen world interwove with the tangible, and that respect for the departed ensured protection and continuity. Rituals dedicated to ancestors were central to the spiritual life of early communities. Songs, chants, and dances recalled their names, their deeds, and the lessons they embodied. By speaking their memory aloud, humans reaffirmed connection, maintaining a circle in which the living and the dead coexisted. These ceremonies were often synchronized with cycles of nature, the rising and setting sun, the phases of the moon. The ripening of crops underscoring the belief that ancestors were intimately linked to the forces sustaining life itself. The role of ancestors extended beyond memory into guidance. Communities sought insight from the spirits of those who had traversed challenges, survived scarcity, or nurtured the group through hardship. Dreams, visions, and signs were interpreted as communication from the past. A pattern of clouds, the flight of birds, or the behavior of animals could be read as messages, subtle indications of direction, safety, or timing. Ancestors were intermediaries, bridges between the mortal and the divine, channels through which humans could navigate uncertainty, death. In this worldview was not a cessation but a transformation. Bodies returned to earth, yet the spirit endured, taking a place within the communal and cosmic order. Life and death formed a continuum, a circle in which the departed remained present and influential. This understanding shaped social practices, guiding how the living treated the dead and, in turn, how they treated each other. Respect, care, and remembrance became central virtues, woven into the fabric of daily existence. Ancestor worship carried profound continuity. Knowledge, skills, and customs were transmitted not only through teaching but through ritual acknowledgement of those who came before. A child learning to cultivate fields or craft tools was simultaneously connected to generations of practitioners who had honed these skills. The past was a living presence, informing the present, ensuring that communities were rooted in memory as much as in the immediate environment. The circle of life included both the living and the dead. Ceremonial spaces often reflected this understanding. Bones might be arranged in patterns that mirrored human gatherings, or relics might be placed at the center of communal activity. These configurations symbolized the unity of existence, reinforcing that the living drew strength, identity, and guidance from those who had passed. Through ritual, the separation between worlds became permeable, and the human experience was expanded to embrace continuity. Memory and reverence, music, song, and movement played a role in recalling ancestors, reinforcing their presence in both heart and mind. Chanting names, performing gestures, and enacting stories preserved the narrative of each generation. Through these acts, communities experienced the invisible threads that linked them to the past, shaping their understanding of identity, morality, and purpose. Ancestors were not distant. They were participants in life's unfolding, ever present within the cycles of growth, death, and renewal. Even in silence, the influence of ancestors was acknowledged. Careful tending of relics, offerings of food or flowers, or quiet reflection at burial sites maintained connection. These acts reinforced that life is relational, interwoven with the past, and attentive to the ongoing presence of those who have departed. Each generation inherited responsibility not only for survival but for maintaining the sacred memory that defined the community's identity. Through the lens of anthropology and archaeology, we glimpse these practices in burial arrangements, relic deposits, and ritual spaces. Yet beyond the material, we perceive the philosophy that guided them. Life is a dialogue, ongoing and intertwined with what came before. Ancestors provided lessons in resilience, guidance through hardship, and continuity across generations. They reminded humans that the circle of existence is neither confined to a single lifetime nor limited to what can be seen on contemplating the sacred role of ancestors. We understand a profound principle. Existence is relational, and memory is sacred. The living and the dead share one circle, and the continuity of life depends on acknowledgement, reverence, and care. The presence of those who came before shapes choices, informs values, and maintains the harmony of human communities with the natural and spiritual worlds. In their silent watchfulness, ancestors remain both teachers and protectors, offering subtle guidance to those willing to listen. Perhaps the quietest, yet most enduring, lesson of ancestor veneration is this: memory carries power. In honoring the past, humans anchor themselves in something larger than immediate experience. They participate in a rhythm that transcends life and death, touching the eternal patterns that sustain communities and connect them to the sacred. Ancestors are more than history. They are living threads woven into the ongoing story of humanity, reminding us that each life is both a gift received and a gift to be passed on. Chapter 18: Fertility Rites and Seasonal Festivals. From the earliest human settlements, the rhythm of life was inseparable from the rhythm of the seasons. Spring arrived as a quiet promise, stirring the soil and awakening the first shoots of growth. It was a time of renewal when the earth's potential mirrored the hopes of those who tilled it. Communities responded with rituals that honored this renewal, offering gratitude for life's return and asking for vitality to carry them through the months ahead. These rites were not mere celebration. They were acknowledgments of the delicate balance between human labor and natural generosity. Summer brought abundance, the long days ripe with possibility. Harvests of fruit, grain, and pasture were anticipated with both work and ceremony. Festivals marked the passage of these months, weaving song, dance, and communal feasting into the life of the settlement. In the warmth of midsummer, people reaffirmed their connection with each other and with the forces that sustained them. Here, the sacred intertwined with the everyday. The act of gathering food became a sacred rhythm, each meal a reflection of life's continuing generosity. As autumn approached, attention shifted from abundance to gratitude. Crops were gathered, and rituals acknowledged the gifts of the earth. Offerings and sacrifices accompanied this season, not in fear, but in recognition that life required reciprocity. Communities reflected on survival, the cycles of birth and death, and the interdependence of humans and the natural world. Autumnal rites were quiet, contemplative, often held in twilight or at the edges of fields where earth met sky. In these ceremonies, gratitude and remembrance fused, affirming that human existence was always a dialogue with the land and its hidden. powers. Winter introduced a different kind of ritual consciousness. The cold and darkness demanded vigilance, a sacred guarding against the silence that threatened life's continuity. Fires were tended, ceremonies were conducted to honor the unseen, and communities gathered close, drawing strength from one another. Winter rites reinforced both protection and hope, acknowledging that even in dormancy, life continued beneath the surface. In these moments, ritual was both practical and symbolic, a means of preserving the energy of life until the world's renewal in spring. Across these seasons, fertility rites remained central. Not merely the fertility of the soil, but the fertility of life itself, the continuity of family, and the vitality of the community. Offerings, dances, and symbolic enactments expressed a profound understanding. Human survival was inseparable from the cycles of nature, and to honor these cycles was to ensure continuity. The sowing of seeds became a prayer, the nurturing of crops a devotional act, and the gathering of harvest a communal blessing. Festivals punctuated these cycles, drawing communities into shared experience. Music, movement, and storytelling reinforced bonds, passing knowledge and cultural memory from one generation to the next. Participation was both joyful and reverent, a blending of celebration and spiritual acknowledgement. Each festival was a reaffirmation that human life exists within a larger order, one that is seen in the turning of seasons, the growth of crops, and the birth and maturation of people themselves. Through centuries, these seasonal rituals and fertility rites shaped the consciousness of early societies. They taught humans to observe, to respond, and to participate in the ongoing dance of life and nature. Seasons became teachers, offering lessons in patience, gratitude, and resilience. The cycle of planting, growing, harvesting, and resting mirrored human experiences of birth, growth, decline, and renewal. In this interplay, humans recognized that they were part of a larger, enduring rhythm. Even today, echoes of these practices persist in cultural celebrations and agricultural ceremonies. Though the specific rites may have evolved, the underlying awareness remains. Life is cyclical, dependent on reciprocity, and inseparable from the natural world. The sacred was embedded not in abstract doctrine, but in lived experience, in the planting and reaping, in song and dance, in offerings and feasts that honored both earth and community. Perhaps the quietest lesson of these seasonal festivals is the understanding of time itself as sacred. Each season holds its own meaning, each cycle a reflection of life's continuity. Fertility rites and communal celebrations were ways for early humans to align themselves with this eternal rhythm, to participate consciously in the patterns that sustain both nature and human society. In observing the year, communities learned to honor not only what they could see and touch, but also the invisible forces that guided existence. In doing so, they discovered that every cycle, every season, carries wisdom if one listens with attentive heart. Chapter 19. Hidden Shrines and Household Altars. Long before grand temples rose in cities, worship often lived quietly within the walls of a home. Families carved small spaces for reverence, corners where spirit and domestic life intertwined. These hidden shrines were intimate, personal, and deeply meaningful. A figurine placed on a shelf, a carved charm resting on the windowsill, each held significance beyond its simple form. They were vessels of attention, of memory, and of devotion. Within these modest confines, daily acts of care and respect became a ritual bridge between the human and the sacred. The objects themselves carried weight. Clay figures, polished stones, tiny idols each served as a focus for prayer, protection, or gratitude. Some were offerings to ancestors, others to deities associated with hearth, fertility, or the cycles of the seasons. Placing a figurine beside the fire was not merely decorative. It was a conscious recognition of forces believed to guide and sustain life. Even the act of tending these small shrines, the lighting of a candle, the arrangement of a charm, the uttering of a simple blessing brought attention to the presence of the divine in ordinary days. These household altars were often hidden, tucked in corners or behind simple screens, suggesting that the sacred was not always meant for display. Their secrecy may have been practical, protecting objects and practices from outside disruption, yet it also created a sense of intimate connection. Worship became woven into daily life, private and ongoing, reminding early humans that reverence could exist in small gestures, repeated quietly rather than solely in public spectacle. The home became a microcosm of the sacred, a place where the divine could be approached at any moment. Unhurried and unobtrusive, families played a central role in maintaining continuity. Through generations, objects, rituals, and prayers were preserved, carrying memory and belief from parent to child. The act of honoring these small shrines was a way to maintain identity, connection, and moral continuity. By tending to a figurine or leaving small offerings in a domestic altar, families acknowledged the cycles of life, the unseen guidance of ancestors, and the subtle presence of protective forces. In this quiet devotion, human beings found reassurance, a sense that they were not alone in the unfolding patterns of daily existence. Even ordinary objects could be transformed into symbols of the sacred. A bowl might hold offerings, a simple cloth could mark a place of prayer, or a string of beads might count chants and invocations. The line between practical and spiritual blurred. In small ways, every act within the household, lighting a fire, preparing a meal, caring for a child, was linked to the sacred through presence and intention. Life itself was infused with reverence, and the domestic sphere became a living temple. These hidden shrines also remind us that devotion need not always be grand or communal. They exemplify a spirituality rooted in intimacy and constancy, in the repetition of small gestures rather than in monumental acts. In the privacy of the home, early humans cultivated a sense of protection and belonging, creating sacred space that responded to their immediate lives. Prayer, ritual, and reflection were not reserved for public ceremonies. They existed quietly, alongside cooking, weaving, and tending the hearth. In this sense, worship became inseparable from everyday life, a steady pulse beneath ordinary activity. Over time, household altars shaped the ways people approached the divine. They encouraged attentiveness to the small, the repeated, the intimate. Through them, sacredness was discovered in what might otherwise be overlooked. The corner of a room, a carefully placed figurine, the pattern of light across a wall. In these spaces, reverence was a practice as natural and necessary as breathing, grounding the human experience in cycles of care, protection, and connection. The domestic and the divine were inseparable, teaching that the smallest offerings could carry great significance. Even today, echoes of these practices remain in subtle gestures, lighting a candle in remembrance, placing a flower on a windowsill, or setting aside a quiet corner for reflection. They are reminders that the sacred does not always require grandeur. It is often found in attention, intention, and presence. The home, in its intimacy, offers a space where the human and divine meet, where continuity and care are honored, and where ordinary objects can become vessels of meaning. In the quiet corners of a household, one can still sense the gentle hum of devotion, the enduring lesson that the sacred dwells within reach, in the spaces we inhabit every day. Chapter 20. The first priests and spiritual leaders in the earliest human communities. Spiritual guidance often arose from those who had seen beyond the ordinary, who understood the subtle rhythms of the natural world. Shamans, with their trances and journeys, were the first to bridge human experience with the unseen. Over time, some of these figures evolved into more structured roles. They became the first priests, the spiritual leaders whose knowledge and presence shaped the communal sense of the sacred. Where once ritual was fluid, directed by the needs of the moment, the emergence of priests introduced guidance, consistency, and a recognition that the invisible world required attention, respect, and interpretation. The role of the priest was multifaceted. Some guided rituals, leading ceremonies that marked the turning of the seasons, the planting and harvesting of crops, or the rites of passage that defined life itself. Others read omens, interpreting the signs carried by stars, weather, or animal behavior. Their authority did not rest on wealth or coercion, but on the wisdom they possessed, the ability to navigate the cycles of nature, to mediate between the living and the unseen, and to maintain balance between the forces that shaped life. Knowledge became power, yet it was a power tied to responsibility, to the ongoing well-being of the community. Communities came to trust these figures because they embodied both continuity and care. The priest's presence offered reassurance, a sense that the mysteries of the world were not entirely beyond human understanding, that life and death, growth and decay could be navigated with insight and guidance. The act of leading a ritual, of interpreting the signs of the world, or of maintaining sacred knowledge was not simple authority. It was a service, a conduit for sustaining life and harmony. The priest was both protector and interpreter, connecting the seen with the unseen, the tangible with the spiritual. Spiritual roles also gave form to early religion, as these leaders organized practices, codified rituals, and guided communal observances. The contours of belief became clearer. Religion took on a structured rhythm, allowing communities to gather, to act collectively, and to affirm shared values and understandings. The priest became the mediator of divine order, the one who held both the memory of what had come before and the guidance for what might come next. Through their leadership, intangible principles, fertility, protection, justice, the cycles of the seasons were given tangible expression. The burden of such a role was profound. Priests carried responsibility for the spiritual health of the group, aware that missteps could invite misfortune or imbalance. Yet alongside this weight was honor. They were respected not only for knowledge, but for the courage to act as intermediaries with forces that the average person might not fully comprehend. Their rituals were performances of careful intention, each action designed to maintain equilibrium between humans, nature, and the unseen forces that shaped daily existence. In this sense, the priesthood was both demanding and sacred, authority derived from knowledge of cycles of the sun, the moon, the seasons, and human life. A priest who could predict the arrival of winter or the timing of rains held not only practical but spiritual influence. Their words guided decisions, from planting crops to preparing for ceremonies. In these early societies, survival and spirituality were inseparable. The guidance of spiritual leaders provided a framework through which communities understood their place in a complex living world. It is easy to imagine the awe with which early humans would have watched these figures perform rituals, chant incantations, or interpret signs, understanding that their well-being rested, in part, on the priest's insight. Ritual leadership also shaped the growth of culture. Priests often became keepers of memory, guardians of myths, stories, and ancestral knowledge. Through ceremonies and instruction, they preserved oral traditions, taught social norms, and reinforced communal cohesion. In guiding these practices, priests did more than mediate the sacred. They shaped identity, values, and the shared sense of belonging. Culture, in many ways, was nurtured alongside spirituality, with the priest at the heart of that interwoven development. Yet the role was never purely practical. Priests occupied a space that was both ordinary and extraordinary, bridging the gap between the human and the divine. Their actions were imbued with intention, and their presence reminded the community that life was intertwined with forces beyond immediate comprehension. To follow a priest was not to submit blindly, but to participate in a rhythm that harmonized individual life with the cycles of nature, the patterns of the heavens, and the currents of unseen worlds. The first priests remind us that leadership in human societies has long been tied to understanding and stewardship, not just power. They carried the responsibility to interpret the world, to mediate its mysteries, and to ensure that daily life aligned with deeper truths. In their hands, rituals became more than routine. They became a dialogue with forces that shaped existence, a way to honor life, to remember the ancestors, and to anticipate what the world would bring next. Even today, traces of this early priesthood remain. When communities gather to celebrate, when rituals mark beginnings and endings, or when individuals seek guidance in moments of uncertainty, we continue to echo the role first embodied by these spiritual leaders. Their legacy is a testament to the human desire to understand, to honor, and to connect with something greater than ourselves. They remind us that leadership rooted in wisdom, care, and reverence can shape not just survival, but the enduring rhythms of culture and spirit. In reflecting on these first priests, one might wonder if the unseen world guided human choice so intimately. What voices continue to whisper through the rituals and rhythms we still observe? How much of our own understanding of balance, morality, and community is shaped by the echoes of those who first stood as intermediaries between earth and the sacred? Chapter 21: Death, Rebirth, and Cycles of Eternity. In the earliest human imagination, life and death were not opposites, but threads woven into the same enduring circle. Observing the rise and fall of the seasons, the sprouting of seeds, and the decay of fallen leaves, people began to understand existence as a cycle rather than a linear journey. Death, in this context, was not a final end but a transformation, a passage into a continuation of life in a form unseen. Burial practices, myths, and ritual observances reflected this awareness, revealing a worldview deeply attuned to the rhythms of nature and the cycles of the cosmos. Burial rituals often mirrored the planting of seeds. Bodies were placed in the earth with care, sometimes accompanied by objects that had held meaning in life: tools, ornaments, food. Some graves were sprinkled with red ochre, symbolizing blood, life, and renewal. Just as a seed must be buried to grow again, so too was the human form returned to the soil, not as a cessation, but as an invitation to transformation. The same earth that nourished crops also held the dead, creating an intimate and continuous link between the living and the departed. Each burial was a quiet acknowledgement of this eternal rhythm, a recognition that death was a return to the greater cycle. Rebirth was sensed, not only in ritual but in the patterns of nature itself. The yearly cycle of seasons offered a constant lesson. The cold of winter gives way to the warmth of spring. Life emerges from dormancy. The harvest returns to sustain the community. These patterns became the foundation for myths, stories that embodied the eternal return. Gods and spirits, heroes and ancestors, were often depicted as moving through death and renewal, reflecting the ongoing dance of life around them. Humanity learned to see itself as part of this dance, bound to the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the fertile earth. Death, therefore, was seen not as absence but as transformation. The human spirit, imagined as enduring, was released from the confines of the body, entering a realm connected with ancestors, nature, or divine presence. This perception gave depth to ritual observance, the way a body was laid to rest, the chants that accompanied burial, the offerings placed in graves, all became acts of reverence, gestures that honored both life that had passed and life that would continue. Communities engaged with mortality not through fear, but through understanding and respect, sensing that each ending contained the seeds of a new beginning. Eternity, in this worldview, was not abstract. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Agricultural cycles, the phases of the moon, the movement of the stars, all echoed the principle that life is a series of returns. People structured their rituals around these cycles, ensuring that the sacred and the temporal moved in concert. This understanding nurtured acceptance. Death did not terrify because it was a known element of the cosmic pattern. It was simply another turn of the wheel, as natural and necessary as the sun's rising or the river's flow. Cycles taught reverence as well as humility. By observing the patterns of birth, growth, decay, and renewal, humans came to recognize the limits of individual control. They saw the world as a continuum in which they participated rather than a machine to command. Rituals, myths, and sacred observances became tools for aligning human life with these eternal rhythms. In honoring death, they honored life. In accepting loss, they acknowledged renewal. The spiritual and the practical were inseparable, guiding daily activity, community planning, and the structure of belief. Through these observances, humanity learned to trust the turning wheel. They understood that the end of one cycle naturally ushered in another. Burial mounds were not silent monuments of sorrow alone. They were symbols of continuity. Seasonal festivals did more than celebrate abundance. They reminded participants of the recurring promise of renewal. The same principles that governed the growth of crops also guided the understanding of human existence. Life and death became a mirror of one another, each reflecting the eternal movement that shaped the world. Myths, too, flourished from this understanding. Stories of gods dying and returning, of heroes descending into the underworld only to emerge renewed, mirrored the cycles observed in the natural world. These narratives provided a framework for understanding existence, allowing communities to contextualize suffering, loss, and change. By embedding the principle of return into story, humans made sense of mortality in ways that were comprehensible, emotionally resonant, and spiritually sustaining. Even everyday life was infused with these insights. The simple acts of planting a seed, tending to livestock, or watching the sun's path across the sky carried symbolic weight. Each was a reminder that nothing exists in isolation. Life emerges, flourishes, fades, and returns. This awareness fostered a quiet respect, a mindfulness that blended the sacred with the practical. In this sense, death and rebirth were not distant concepts. Reserved for priests or shamans, they were experienced continuously, as tangible as the soil beneath one's feet and the air that carries breath. As humans engaged with these cycles, they also began to perceive the interconnectedness of all life. The turning wheel was not confined to humanity alone. Plants, animals, rivers, and winds followed their own rhythms, creating a complex web of interdependence. Rituals and offerings often acknowledged these relationships, recognizing that the vitality of the community depended on maintaining harmony with forces larger than themselves. Death was not the removal of a single thread from the fabric, but part of the ongoing weave that connected all existence. In reflecting on these ancient perspectives, one may sense a gentle invitation to recognize that endings are not absolute, that the cessation of one form often signals the emergence of another. Human life, observed through the lens of cycles, is an ongoing journey of transformation, where the temporal and the eternal coexist. The ancestors, the soil, the sky, and the flowing waters all participate in a rhythm that humans can observe, honor, and align with through ritual, reflection, and action. And so, death, rebirth, and the cycles of eternity were not abstract teachings. They were lived experience. Communities observed, acted, and celebrated these rhythms, cultivating a profound awareness that life is a continuous return, a mirror of nature's enduring flow. In witnessing and participating, humanity learned acceptance, reverence, and a patient understanding that everything follows the turning wheel. It is a reminder that in each ending there is potential, in each departure a promise of renewal, and in every life the silent echo of eternity. Perhaps even now, if one pauses to watch the turning of the seasons, to trace the path of the moon, or to witness a seed sprouting in spring, one can feel the same rhythm that guided these ancient observances: a quiet, patient assurance that life and death are inseparable, circling endlessly in the eternal dance of the world. Chapter 22: Reflections beneath the ancient stars. As night falls, the world settles into quiet, and humanity once again lifts its gaze to the heavens. The sky, vast and unwavering, has always drawn the eye upward, inviting contemplation and wonder. Long before written history, before cities and temples, humans traced patterns among the stars, searching for meaning in the points of light scattered across the darkness. These first observations were not simply practical, they were deeply spiritual. The stars became mirrors of time, guides of seasonal change, and symbols of the questions that stirred within the human mind. In the Neolithic night, the stars offered both orientation and reflection. They marked the planting and harvesting of crops, the timing of communal gatherings, and the rhythms of life itself. But they were more than celestial calendars. They were companions in the silent quest to understand existence. The first humans saw in their flickering light an echo of themselves, tiny sparks of awareness in a vast, unending cosmos. To sit beneath that expanse was to feel both small and infinite, a paradox that shaped the earliest spiritual intuitions. Rituals performed under these ancient skies were infused with that awareness. Fires burned, sending smoke skyward, and circles of stone or timber marked sacred spaces. Chanting rose into the night, and the cadence of drums or flutes echoed the pulse of life on earth. Each action, each rhythm, was an attempt to join with the enduring patterns of the heavens, to reflect the cycles above in the ceremonies below. From these practices grew a profound understanding. The divine was not located only in distant peaks or hidden groves, but in the intimate act of aligning human life with the rhythms of the cosmos, from fire to stone, from dream to shrine. The journey of human spirituality is continuous. The same awe that led a Neolithic farmer to watch the solstice sunrise also inspired the construction of monumental alignments, such as stone circles and burial mounds, where the rising or setting sun intersected with carefully placed stones. The sky became a living text, one that required careful observation, patience, and participation. Each generation learned from the last, observing the cycles of planets, the movement of the moon, and the subtle shifts of the seasons, embedding these lessons into ritual, myth, and memory. The divine, in this context, was not distant, unreachable, or abstract. It was found in closeness, in the act of noticing, honoring, and participating in the world's ongoing rhythms. The sacred was present in the shimmer of starlight on the soil, in the warmth of fire against night chill, in the communal act of singing or offering. Humanity learned that connection, attentiveness, and reverence were as potent as any grand monument or elaborate temple. The stars reminded humans that they were both observers and participants in a universe that moves in cycles, unseen yet profoundly ordered. Even today, these ancient practices continue to shape our spiritual longing. The same instincts that guided early humans toward the night sky still stir within us. We look upward, sometimes for navigation, sometimes for solace, often for reflection. In the stillness of darkness, the patterns of the cosmos invite quiet contemplation, echoing the questions that have always arisen. Where do we come from? Where are we going? How can we align our brief lives with the vast, enduring movements of the universe? As you drift toward rest, it is possible to feel these ancient whispers. Imagine the eyes of your ancestors lifting to the same constellations, their rituals, their offerings, their chants vibrating with curiosity and reverence. Their connection to the stars was not merely scientific. It was intimate, emotional, and spiritual. They found meaning in the patterns, stories in the shapes, and guidance in the cycles. In these small, quiet acts, they left a legacy of contemplation that flows into our own experience of night and wonder. The story is eternal, and you are part of it. The quiet pulse of the cosmos, the rhythms of seasons, the enduring presence of the stars, they all continue to shape our perception of the sacred. Each moment beneath the sky is an opportunity to reconnect with those first reflections, to sense the subtle currents of human inquiry that have flowed for millennia. Even as individual lives pass, the continuity of curiosity and devotion persists, binding generations across time in shared recognition of something larger than themselves. In this space, beneath the ancient stars, there is both humility and intimacy. Humility in realizing our smallness within the vast cosmic weave. Intimacy in knowing that our attention, our presence, our reflection is part of a long chain of human wonder. The stars hold memory, not only of cosmic events, but of human questioning. The soft echoes of those who first asked the questions we continue to ask. Every glance upward, every moment of quiet observation, joins us to them. And so, as the night deepens and silence spreads, consider the subtle truth carried in this eternal practice. The sacred resides not only in distant realms, but in the closeness of attention, in the gentle act of observing, reflecting, and participating in the rhythms of life. Beneath the vast expanse of stars, the human spirit learns patience, continuity, and reverence. In those quiet moments, the distant and the immediate, the ancient and the present, converge. The cosmos continues its cycle, the earth its rhythms, and within both, humanity finds its place. Perhaps, as sleep draws near, you can sense the same connection your ancestors once did, the feeling of being aligned, however briefly, with the enduring sky above, the eternal pulse of life, and the quiet mystery that is always whispered to those who dare to look upward.